Hi everyone, welcome back to Mr. Night Scare's story. Before you drift off, let me know in the comments where you're listening from if you're enjoying the stories. Don't forget to like and subscribe now. Let's relax and jump into tonight's case. Story 1. The BTK Killer's Daughter. Gabby Petito's parents. JonBenét's dad. America turned their darkest moments into a never-ending spectacle. I went to see just how far that's gone. The Gaylord Opryland Resort is an artificial oasis in the barrens of northern Nashville, Tennessee. Colossal palm trees reach toward the glass ceiling in the hotel's verdant conservatory, sealing the grounds in a perpetual equatorial humidity. A few Disneyland-esque waterfalls crash into the rippling stream that circles the miniature shopping concourse below. It includes what the resort refers to as the only Jack Daniel's restaurant in the world. This has traditionally been a setting for country music, particularly the historic Grand Ole Opry. But on this summer day, it provided a jarring contrast to an entirely different kind of event. As hundreds gathered nearby, Tara Petito stepped up to a microphone and imagined out loud what she might have said to Brian Laundrie, the man who murdered her daughter. He robbed our daughter, our beautiful Gabby, of her life, her future. He robbed her of the chance to ever know what it's like to walk down the aisle with the love of her life, to bear children, to grow old, she said, grief flickering, then smoldering in her throat. He is a horrible excuse for a human being. If Brian was alive today, any words out of his mouth would be lies. The disappearance of Gabby Petito was one of the most pervasive crime stories of 2021. The 22-year-old was traveling across the United States over the summer in a camper van with her fiancé, Laundrie, with the intention of documenting their journey in blooming, hashtagable snapshots on #VanLife Instagram. But Petito vanished during the trip, stirring up a whirlwind of speculative press, condemnation of police malpractice in domestic violence cases, and anger at the elisions of social media. Petito's body was discovered in a Wyoming park 3 weeks later, and in October, Laundrie, who had since disappeared himself, was found dead by a self-inflicted gunshot wound, alongside a notebook in which he admitted to the crime. The frenzy that consumed Gabby's murder turned the mixed Petito family, her stepmother Tara, her stepfather Jim, and her biological parents, Nicole and Joe, into celebrities. They have thousands of social media followers and have been featured in countless glossy magazine interviews and cable specials. Now here they were in Nashville at CrimeCon, one of many stops of a live true crime circuit that subsumes families like these for years after the unthinkable happens to someone they love, providing them a forum to recount their sorrow and suffering to eager audiences. Even 3 years after Gabby's murder, everything the Petitos will say at CrimeCon is treated like breaking news. By the end of the convention, recaps of the family's appearances will be published by Fox News and CNN. CrimeCon, now in its 8th year, fashions itself as the singular nexus for the large and loosely defined true crime community, aiming to summon a fandom that exists primarily online, through twisting subreddits, gumshoeing podcasts, and lengthy comment threads on the 2020 Facebook page, into physical space. The convention drew 6,000 guests this year, an uptick from the 5,000 who attended 2023's event in Orlando. Tickets started at $229 and are tiered between standard, gold, and platinum packages, with the latter offering fast-track lanes, private lounges, and exclusive memorabilia from the event's talent, many of whom are the family members of murderers and murder victims alike. The CrimeCon imprint has been successful enough that Red Seat Ventures, the company behind the convention, as well as a larger portfolio that includes flagship podcasts from Bari Weiss and Megyn Kelly, is set to expand. It has already made landfall in the United Kingdom, and this winter, it will take to the high seas for the annual crime cruise. The patrons get their money's worth. Over the course of a single weekend, Nashville's CrimeCon clientele, young and old, but overwhelmingly white and female, will orbit through a variety of keynotes and panels. Nancy Grace and Chris Hansen are on the docket, as are the authors of whodunits like Aphrodite Jones. Elsewhere, you'll find emergent stars, like the pseudonymous hosts of the ludicrously popular small-town Dick's Media brand, and Anthony Ames, a former NXIVM member who now co-hosts the true crime podcast A Little Bit Culty. But looming above the rest of the field, haunting every corner of this event, are the victims and the people connected to them. John Ramsey, father of JonBenet Ramsey, is a headliner, as are Denise Huskins and Aaron Quinn, the couple who were implicated, then exonerated, in a wild kidnapping scheme that was recounted in the hit Netflix true crime docuseries American Nightmare. Further down the bill, you'll find Summer Shiflett, the sister of Lori Vallow Daybell, who received a life sentence for the murder of her children and another woman. On the second day of the convention, a few hours before Shiflett was scheduled to speak, Daybell's husband would be sentenced to death for the crimes. Undaunted, Shiflett took the stage. "When I heard those words, it was everything I needed to hear," she said to a packed house in the main theater, in an exclusive response to the news. The convention does not compensate its guests for their appearances. Most of them are expected to pay for their travel and lodging. Still, these victims flock to CrimeCon to make their bereavement public and consumable. They will spend the weekend addressing their life-altering tragedies in a variety of different panels, Q&A sessions, meet and greets, and cocktail hours. They will be flagged down by badge holders concealing morbid curiosities. They will be wreathed with condolences, pose for pictures, and autograph the inside covers of their memoirs. All the while, they will be reacquainted with the terrible way they've become famous. Tara Petito is, unsurprisingly, a superstar in this world. Laundrie murdered our daughter, drove back to his family's home, and then went on vacation while Gabby lay cold, out in the wilderness, with the grizzly bears, she said during her session. "Thinking about the pain our baby girl had to endure is truly agonizing. Visualizing her final moments over and over again is a pain I wish on no one. The trauma it causes is unexplainable. Sometimes I feel like I've downed a bottle of pills, but I'm completely sober. All because of that piece of garbage." This was CrimeCon in its basic essence. Powerful, tender, and undeniably lurid. It left me with a question I couldn't stop asking in Nashville. What on earth brings people like Petito here? She has repeated this story many times since her daughter was murdered. She has sat down with Dr. Phil and Sean Hannity. She has told People magazine that she feels as if her daughter is sending her messages from the heavens. Yet, still, she's once again reliving the worst event of her life. Not just as a victim and a survivor, but as a CrimeCon dignitary. I embarked on a surreal weekend to find out why. A few hours before Tara Petito's panel, right after CrimeCon opened its doors, guests were funneled into one of Opryland's immense auditoriums, which would serve as the convention's marquee dais for the rest of the weekend. The lights dimmed over a phalanx of identical chairs, all pointed in the direction of two gargantuan projection monitors hovering over a Spartan stage. CSI-flavored yellow text beamed across the screens, underlaid with the urgent clacking of a laptop keyboard. "Through all the tales of triumph and tragedy, we are here to remind you that these aren't just stories," read the text. "These are real families, real lives." What followed was a medley of cable news clips, edited together in warp speed, providing a recap of the past year in crime. The Rust shooting was mentioned, for which Alec Baldwin had not yet been cleared, along with the potential unmasking of Tupac Shakur's killer and the long-awaited release of Gypsy Rose Blanchard. The audience cheered the heroes and heckled the villains, right on cue, with an obvious fluency in all order of unsolved mysteries. The Delphi murders case, for which a trial is finally imminent, got a huge ovation. The montage rounded out with a series of heartening conclusions. Criminals busted, missing people recovered, truths revealed. The show had come to life. Eminem's "Lose Yourself" poured out of the speakers. Joe Petito, Tara's husband, would later tell me he had been scared to come to CrimeCon the first time. After watching the introduction video, I understood why. Joe had feared that people were attending this convention to gawk at him, focusing on, in his words, the gory details of his daughter's killing. The whole Petito family grasped the bitter irony of their presence, he said. Jim Schmidt, Gabby's stepfather, recalled the years his wife had spent as a true crime junkie, basking in the enthralling puzzle of a provocative murder, savoring the careful distance from the pain. You see the stories and are like, that's not real. How did that happen? He told me. And before you know it, you're living it. Joe has come around, though. This is now the second CrimeCon the Petitos have attended. Joe treats the weekends like a vacation. People are looking for inspiration. They're looking for help with their own lives, he said. I was pleasantly surprised by how giving the people here are. The panel that featured Tara was called Finding a Voice. Victim Impact Statement Readings. Typically, victim impact statements are read in court before sentencing occurs. The idea is to allow survivors a chance to color a perpetrator's crimes with their own accounts, pairing clinical procedure with visceral experience. 5 women had volunteered to speak at this panel, 2 of whom were reciting the same statements they had delivered at the trials where their own perpetrators met justice. The other 3 were never afforded the opportunity in court, so they intended to use this venue and its ticketed audience to conjure an alternate timeline where they could look into the eyes of the person who had caused them so much misery. One of the volunteers was Emo Silva, the daughter of Deanna Butterfield, who was raped and murdered by William Huff, the Bay Area prowler, in 1987. Her body was found in the picnic area of a Berkeley park. Her killer wasn't sentenced until 2018, some 30 years later. Silva was choking back tears even before she began reading at the lectern. She had been just 4 years old when her grandmother called her to the living room and informed her that her mom was sick. Silva suggested a trip to the pharmacy to get medicine that might heal her. Then her grandmother told her the truth. "My heart sank, and I began to cry," she said. There was a long pause, and Silva began to visibly wither under the lights, matching the stifled sobs that slipped out of the audience. "Just as I am now, because I knew I would never see her again." By the time Silva and I spoke after her speech, she had regained her composure. She was wearing a silver butterfly pendant, joining some that float down a half-sleeve tattoo on her right arm. Her mom had had a small butterfly tattoo on her chest. The panel was Silva's one and only CrimeCon duty. She had depicted her suffering with excruciating clarity for a crowd of onlookers who could never understand, and now the job was complete. I had the same question for her as I had for the others. Why would anybody do this to themselves? CrimeCon is focused on the front part of crime, but we're forgetting about the end, and that's the aftermath and the victims, she told me. Attendees look at all these cases and want to hear about all the details, and then their interest stops. But that isn't the end. That's just the beginning of a new phase that sucks. So if you're going to do all of this, let the people see the messy part. Let them have access to people like me. Let them feel the rawness. Away from the ballroom, in the convention's central gallery, exhibitors awaited guests. Aging mystery authors reclined behind gory paperbacks. Representatives of collegiate criminal justice programs stood ready to recruit aspiring investigators. Podcasters prepared promotional souvenirs, pins, brochures, and stickers, all splayed out like Halloween candy on their tables. Court TV, the former cable channel that has since been relegated to digital broadcasting, had one of the largest booths in the building, equipped with a slab of cardboard printed with the question, "What's your true crime obsession?" By the end of the weekend, it was covered with sticky notes bearing all sorts of answers. Serial killers plus culty things, read one. All of it, said another. Standing alone amid the pulp was a booth belonging to the National Center for Victims of Crime, a nonprofit that helps rehabilitate families languishing in the aftermath of a tragedy. Renee Williams, an advocate and the organization's executive director, distributed to those passing by a sheet detailing 8 simple rules for being an ethical, true crime fan. The bullet points were boiled down to lean, punchy mantras. Do no harm. Respect boundaries. It was Williams who had orchestrated the afternoon's victim impact statement readings, a project that she hoped would remind CrimeCon's attendees of the trauma that a highly scrutinized mystery can inflict. Williams was happy with how the readings had gone, but she had fretted about the optics of the panel for weeks before the convention. "I'm always worried if something is exploitative," she said. "Are we putting something out for someone's entertainment?" The National Center for Victims of Crime has for years had a presence at CrimeCon, but initially, Williams said, her colleagues in the victim services sphere weren't happy about those appearances. It's a fair point. Could a commercial enterprise profiting in part off suffering performed by the invited victims sustain credible advocacy? The exhibition hall was a testament to the event's enormous contradictions. The Black and Missing Foundation, a nonprofit dedicated to raising awareness for uncracked cases involving victims of color, had a well-staffed studio near the main entrance. But the end of the promenade was marked by the convention's official merch shop, hawking t-shirts printed with slogans like, "Talk motive to me," "Catch killers not feelings," and perhaps the biggest hit at the convention, "I'm only here for an alibi." Later, a select group of badge holders would be gathered for a sketch and sip event hosted by renowned courtroom artist Bill Robles, who has immortalized everyone from Harvey Weinstein to Charles Manson at the defendant's table. The party would step to their easels, wine glasses in hand, and learn what it takes to portray a striking cross-examination of a predator. How do you reconcile one with the other? As far as Williams was concerned, you don't. To her, the only perspectives that matter belong to the bereaved, and they had made the trip to Nashville of their own accord. "I'm a victim advocate. I'm not their mother. I have to let them make decisions as adults," she said. "I need to trust their instincts." This was the third year in a row John Ramsey had attended CrimeCon, and he still wasn't quite sure why anyone would pay for a ticket. In an hour, he was due to take the convention's main stage, opposite author Paula Woodward and a box of tissues, for a high-profile panel titled, "Searching for Truth." His 6-year-old daughter JonBenét's notorious murder and all that came out of it have given him plenty of time to contemplate the enduring fascination with the case. "Some of the attendees are these amateur detectives who treat it like a real-life board game," he said. "They stop me in the halls. They say they only came to the convention just to meet me. I'm almost embarrassed by it. I'm not that great. I've not done anything spectacular." Ramsey is 80 years old, and JonBenet has been dead for nearly 3 decades. Nobody at CrimeCon has been in the spotlight longer than he has. Ramsey's media portfolio includes appearances on Dr. Phil, The Doctor, a Show, and a memorably uncomfortable Barbara Walters interview in 2000, in the still-simmering aftermath of the crime. He has also published 2 books, the first defending himself from those who suspected his family's involvement in the killing, and a second reflecting on the combined grief of JonBenét's murder and the death of his wife Patsy from ovarian cancer in 2006. This has all helped ensure that the lurid interest in JonBenet has never faded. "I have a file on my email account for the crazy people. I put all of that stuff in there," said Jan Rousseau, Ramsey's 3rd wife, whom he married 5 years after Patsy died. Rousseau hadn't been anywhere near Colorado during Christmas 1996, but missives from the dedicated and the unhinged bombard her inbox all the time. The other night, his phone kept vibrating. "BZZT, BZZT, BZZT. Finally, I got up because I thought someone we know might be in trouble," Rousseau said. But no, it was a woman in Canada, sending a series of photos and texts, 11 of them, saying, "I am your daughter. I am JonBenet." Ramsey believes that this is a good problem to have. Police investigations tend to be malleable to scrutiny, and if you trust his account, that a roving invader broke into his house, tortured and murdered his daughter, and stashed her body in the basement, then you must also trust that Ramsey is being honest when he says that he is doing everything in his power to focus the fraught nature of his celebrity on the objective of finding JonBenét's killer. Ramsey makes sure to read all the unhinged emails that Rousseau detailed, even the ones that are erratic and dissertation length. "You're always looking for that little nugget that isn't public information," he said. "I want to clear the cloud," Ramsey said when asked why he keeps saying yes to things like CrimeCon. "My family needs the cloud removed. It's not going to change my life at this point, but for them it will." In Nashville, I learned that Ramsey is correct about the advantages of his stardom. Maggie Zingman, a 69-year-old from Oklahoma whose pink horn-rimmed glasses protrude from curtains of silver hair, would do anything to swap places with him. She has a slain daughter too. Her name was Brittany Phillips. Zingman often wears an oversized pin displaying Phillips' high school portrait. On this day, it's dangling heavily from her collar. In 2004, Phillips was raped and murdered in her Tulsa apartment. She was 18, and she was buried on her 19th birthday. Investigators never came up with a suspect, nor did any national reporters sniff around to ramp up the pressure. So, when Phillips' case went cold, Zingman took matters into her own hands. She plastered her SUV with pictures of her young daughter and printed the number of a tip line along its doors. Zingman has been driving across the country, on and off, since 2007, searching for a lead. That odyssey had now brought her to CrimeCon. Standing next to Zingman was a life-sized cardboard cutout of her daughter. "Do you know me?" reads the text near her head. "I'm the girl next door. Zingman is not a featured speaker at this year's event. She will not be appearing on any panels or conducting any book signings or meet and greets. Therein lies the problem. Despite her best efforts, the slaughter of Brittany Phillips has never achieved nearly the same resonance as other American tragedies. This fact has left Zingman alone with the most horrible of mortal sensations. A twinge of envy as she watches the zeitgeist wash over the bereaved mothers who happen to have a more famous dead daughter. Do I get jealous? Yes. Is it hard? Yes. But I can't be ashamed about it. It's human nature. I see the Petito family talking to all of these people. Chris Hansen, Paul Holes, John Walsh. National news attention is the only thing that's going to change my case, and if my story could get in their hands. Zingman told me. There are thousands of us out there. I'm from Middle America. My daughter had gone away to college. She had a chemistry scholarship. She was beautiful, but that's too normal. Candace Cooley, the mother of Dylan Rounds, a Utah teen whose murderer pleaded guilty to the crime earlier this year, told me at the conference she had been in Zingman's position until she got lucky, in the grimmest sense of the word. Cooley's calls to her local news stations had gone unreturned for weeks after her son's disappearance, until one day she began to weave his biographical details into her plight. Rounds had left home at 17 to start a farm on his grandfather's property. The color of his life was enough to overcome the algorithm. Suddenly, Round's story was everywhere. We gave him a brand. Gabby was the blogger, and Dylan was the farmer. Unfortunately, that's what it takes, Cooley said. Our Facebook group exploded to 20,000 people after that, and that's when the media grabbed it. She was wearing a gray sweatshirt embellished with the logo of her foundation, Dylan's Legacy. 2 stalks of wheat crisscrossing under a sunflower. It's almost like you have to market your missing child, she said. In 2023, when some of the details surrounding Round's murder were still murky and hot on the tabloid circuit, CrimeCon sprang for Cooley's flight and hotel so she could attend the convention. Cooley was assigned to a meet and greet session that she found unpleasant and dehumanizing. I had people coming up to me that I don't know, telling me that they loved me, and they want to hug me, and that they love my son so much, Cooley said. I felt like a circus monkey, she added. It's like you're put on display. Like, oh, you paid $300 extra just to meet me. Lately, Cooley's friendships with the other big names on the true crime junket had strengthened, to the point where the promise of a reunion with them was one of the main reasons she traveled to Nashville. Cooley has grown particularly close with the Petitos. Now that their cases have been mostly settled, their shared focus has turned to families of missing children who have never been showered with the same attention, absorbing, then reflecting the spotlight. It was here that I began to understand one part of the enduring gravitational pull victims experience with CrimeCon. Even as the Tara Petito panel focused on the still raw aftermath of her daughter's murder, Jim Schmidt and Joe Petito, Gabby's stepfather and father, respectively, appeared on another panel, which spotlighted Indigenous women who had been disproportionately victimized by violent crime. Sitting next to them on stage was Vangie Randall Shorty, a Navajo woman whose son Zachariah Juwan Shorty was abducted and killed in New Mexico by an unknown person in 2020. Joy Sutton, the panel's host and the woman behind the podcast Untold Stories. Black and Missing, asked Joe what he made of missing white woman syndrome, a term used to describe how preoccupied the news apparatus can become with the disappearance of someone who fits Gabby's precise demographic background. Joe replied with several factors that he thinks led to the media circus, a gap in the tabloid cycle, and, yes, perhaps the color of her skin. It was extraordinary to watch him analyze the horrific death of his daughter from such a vantage point, considering how heavily the loss still weighs on the Petito family. Jim told me that since Gabby went missing, pretty much everything makes him cry. There's a cheesy Publix commercial in particular that reveals the extent of his heartbreak. It's about a stepdad and a daughter, he said. It goes through the years, and the daughter is saying, "Thanks, Dad." High school graduation. "Thanks, Dad." Jim's voice trailed off, and his eyes began to well up. "That's what happens," Joe said. "I walked into a room where my wife was watching 90 Day Fiancé. I sat down to watch just for a few minutes. The first thing I saw on the TV happened to be a dad walking his daughter down the aisle, and I started bawling. If the two of them are to share this domain, with the specter of their catastrophe waiting to pounce, Then perhaps it makes sense that the Petitos are doing whatever they can to give this new life meaning, or at least to be dutiful custodians for other bereaved parents who have recently joined, in Jim's words, the club. It's validating, he said. Everybody knows our story, but we're here alongside other victims to elevate them. And that's how we always frame those sessions. It's our purpose, Joe said. At the Victim Impact session, the same one where Tara Petito and Emo Silva spoke, there was also Carrie Rawson, the famous daughter of the BTK killer, Dennis Rader. She was there to break some unsettling news in the case. After reviewing Rader's coded diaries as part of an ongoing police investigation to uncover more of his crimes, she discovered evidence that she, too, had been sexually abused by her father. The revelation lined up with a buried memory. Rawson was 2 years old when the incident happened, she believed. She has a faint recollection of a large man hulking over her childhood bedroom, which contextualized the lifelong problems she's had with her neck. Rawson said she confronted Rader with the charges in prison, where he is serving 10 consecutive life sentences. He told her it was a fantasy. This latest twist in the BTK saga quickly made headlines across the true crime media ecosystem. Reports of the horror immediately popped up on News Nation and the New York Post. A couple of days later, in a bit of whiplash, I came to see Rawson sign some books in the convention's meet and greet room. She sat in front of a paperboard backdrop stamped with the CrimeCon logo. Yellow caution tape stretched over a black and white thumbprint. The heaviness of the material didn't affect the mood in the lobby. Rawson was breezy and hospitable. One of the first fans in line to meet her was Candy Griffin, a realtor from Texas. She had started following Rawson's writing career on Facebook and Twitter after they first met in the VIP lounge of last year's CrimeCon, where the two had hit it off immediately. They have had remarkably similar lives, Griffin thought. Both have lived in the exact same region of rural northeastern Kansas. She connected with how Rawson wrote about loss. Griffin is surprised that they didn't meet ages ago. My father wasn't a serial killer, Griffin said. But there are a lot of things that interlink us. The dissonance continued. On Sunday morning, the final day of the convention, the booths in the exhibition hall were already being packed into boxes. Most of the victims had caught flights out of Nashville, and by the afternoon, CrimeCon had vanished without a trace. But in its dying embers, you could find a brand new placard set up in the Opryland foyer. CrimeCon 2025 in Denver had just been announced. Tickets are on sale now. Story number 2. There was more than a simple mark linking these murder cases to each other. Abby, I shout from the bottom of the stairs. You'll be late for school. It's the same routine every morning. Finally she appears, trots down with her nose in a book and bypasses me without a word. The front door bangs shut behind her and I sigh. She's been like this since her dad left to move in with his secretary. I shake off domestic and switch into cop mode. It's something I've become good at over the years. When I arrive at the station, a colleague informs me there's a briefing at 9. I hover outside the meeting room as the clock ticks closer to the hour and there's no sign of my partner. Tyler is notorious for his tardiness. Fortunately, today he makes it just in time. As soon as I step inside, I feel the tension of the assembled officers as whispers circulate the room. My heart sinks as Detective Superintendent Philomena Newton holds up a hand to silence the crowd. He's struck again, she announces without preamble, her face grim as she confirms my suspicions. Not that I've seen it any other way since her husband, Tony, passed away after leaving her for another woman. So the rumors go. She clicks a button on her remote control and the screen behind her lights up. A photograph from the crime scene appears, stark and graphic. Beside me, Tyler winces. Newton's blue eyes, however, remain icy calm. The victim matches the profile, male, mid-40s, dark-haired. The killer has used the same gratuitous method as in the previous 3 cases. Once again, he's left his calling card, D.S. Newton explains, zooming in on the victim's chest. In black marker pen, T is drawn upon the right bicep like a tattoo. The team had speculated about the meaning of this symbol for months, and I've remained open-minded. Lisa, Newton says, and I straighten. I'm putting you in charge of the case in Barton's absence. You'll report directly to me. Ma'am, I respond immediately. unsurprised by the announcement. Barton is off work due to his wife's recent illness, and I'm the obvious choice, being next in command. I've never worked a serial killer case before, though. After a few more minutes of operational discussion, the meeting ends. As officers file out of the room, DS Newton signals for me to hang back. We wait for the last man to leave. As usual, Newton doesn't mince her words. "Can you handle it?" she asks bluntly, and I stiffen. Of course, she studies my eyes for several moments before giving a sharp nod. "You're the only woman on the team. Don't let me down." With that, I'm dismissed. When Tyler and I arrive at the crime scene, forensics are nearly done. The body remains in situ. We interview the uniformed officers who were first to respond to the 999 call, then question the lead crime scene investigator about his initial findings. "Hit me, Bob. What are you thinking?" I say. Once again, the scene is clean as a whistle. No hairs, fingerprints, or a weapon. I nod. The angle and position of the initial wound suggests a left-handed perpetrator. Again, I nod. This matches what we know from forensic examinations of previous victims. The fact that he always stabs his victim in the back first is something on which I've been ruminating. He pauses. Tyler shifts beside me, and I sense his impatience for new information. But I've worked with Bob for much longer than him, and I trust that what he's about to say is worth waiting for. This is just speculation, of course, but I think this pattern suggests that the killer is much weaker than his victims. My breath hitches. "You don't agree with the theory that he wants to take them by surprise?" Bob shakes his head. "I was talking to a criminal psychologist friend of mine. Her take is that the killer would want to be face-to-face when striking the first blow, but is hindered by something. A disparity in strength would explain this, as would the violence of the secondary wounds. He's frustrated that his desire is thwarted. My heart is pounding as instinct tells me that he could be on to something that our own criminal psychologist had missed. Did she say anything about the symbol?" The CSI shakes his head. "We didn't get on to that. We promised to catch up another time to discuss the subject further." "I'd like to speak to her," I say. "Sarah Lowe has an office in the city's most prestigious university." I knock on the door promptly at 4 p.m. "Come in," a voice calls. She stands as we enter. The first thing I notice is the messiness of the room. Stacks of textbooks and papers sit precariously on her desk, ready to topple off at the slightest knock. The floor is strewn with paraphernalia that Tyler and I have to maneuver around. She's not what I'd pictured, but in this job I've learned to expect the unexpected. "Take a seat," she tells us, and Tyler and I do so. "You said that this was about the tattoo killer?" she says once we're all settled. "Yes." I hadn't told her much on the phone, so I recap what Bob reported. "I have some further questions, if that's okay?" "Of course. I'm interested in your thoughts on the symbol. What do you think it represents, and what is its significance?" Without hesitation, Sarah answers. "It's a letter. It's clearly related to the motive." "How so?" Tyler asks, frowning. He's firmly of the school of thought that the mark isn't a letter. The psychologist leans forward, clasping her hands before her on the desk. "My theory is that it represents a word that would explain why she's committing these acts. Could be..." "Wait," I interrupt. "She?" Her eyebrows shoot up. "You hadn't considered that the killer is female?" Tyler snorts, but I stare at Sarah. "Explain, please." "While it's true that most serial killers are male," she begins, "women perpetrators are not unheard of. As I told Bob, given the location and angle of the primary wound, the victims would clearly be able to overpower the killer if confronted face-to-face. It's not hard to come to the conclusion that the killer might be a female. And her motive?" Asked. "Vicarious revenge on the mysterious T. You think T is a person?" Sarah nods. "It makes sense." It does. Abby is home when I enter the house, sitting on the couch, reading. I glance at the cover. As usual, it's a crime novel. "Good day," I ask, hovering in the doorway. She grunts without looking up from the page. I decide that enough is enough. I move across the room and pull the book from her hand. "Mom," she complains, but I toss it on the coffee table and give her a stern look. "I've just been given a massive case," I say. "I'm tired and stressed. I could do without your attitude when I get home after a long day. I wait for her to blow up, but she doesn't. Is it the tattoo killer? She asks quietly instead. I nod, unsurprised that she's aware of the case. It's been plastered all over the news for months. I kick off my flats and take a seat beside her. She leans her head against me and I wrap my arm around her shoulders. Want to talk about it? She asks softly. I can't. I sigh. Must be difficult knowing it's someone on the inside. I frown at this. In prison? No, she rolls her eyes. Still the teenager despite her momentary display of maturity. Someone on the force. What makes you say that? She shrugs. The newspaper says there's no forensic evidence in any of the cases. It doesn't take a genius to put two and two together. It's someone who knows how not to get caught. It's a well-known trope in my books. I want to dismiss the notion as a silly plotline, but something is telling me to think about what she said more deeply. Could this be another missing piece of the puzzle? Everything I've learned today suddenly seems to make sense. I need to make a phone call, I tell her abruptly. She looks up at me as I stand. Did I help? Despite my tension, I force a smile. You did. Thanks, love. D.S. Newton lives in a quiet street on the edge of the city. I ring the bell and wait for her to answer the door. Lisa, come in, she says, smiling tightly. She leads me to her kitchen, where a pan of stew bubbles away on the hob. She lowers the heat before turning to me. You said you have news that can't wait? I swallow, suddenly realizing how ridiculous my words might sound to her. But plow ahead anyway. There's a new theory that you should know about. She listens as I outline the events of the day. When I've finished, she stares at me in what I assume is disbelief. I feel my cheeks heat. Then her professional briskness returns. Thank you for bringing this theory to my attention, Lisa. Let me see you out. I feel a wave of nausea as I wonder if I've just ended my career. The DS gestures for me to lead the way, so I turn and start walking back to the door leading to the hallway. I'm still mentally beating myself up for being a fool to bother her with this nonsense when I hear it, the sound of metal sliding against a surface. Instinctively, I twist. A sharp pain explodes in my right side. I gasp and look into D.S. Newton's cold eyes. She withdraws the knife and attempts another blow. I'm facing her now, and despite my injury, I'm still taller and stronger than the older woman. I grab her left wrist just before the implement plunges into my side again. Bending her hand back, I hear her cry out in pain and the weapon drops from her grasp. But Newton is nothing if not determined. She hits out at me with her free hand and my head whips back. I recover quickly and grip her right wrist. The sound of our harsh breaths fills the room as we strain against each other. Locked in a test of will, I hear a sound behind me. It's Tyler, late as usual, but I've never been happier to see him. Who is T? I ask Newton as I sit opposite her in an interview room. My bandaged side throbs, but I ignore it. Her lip curls and she looks away. But the DS's act of defiance is undermined by the clank of the handcuffs that secure her wrists. I wait. When her eyes meet mine again, there's anger burning in the blue depths. You of all people should understand. I'm taken aback by the statement. Why? I ask evenly. You know what it's like to be betrayed. Suddenly the final piece of the puzzle clicks into place. They reminded you of Tony, I say, and in that single sentence the case is solved. Story number 3. In this crime short story, set in 1985, in a radio recording studio, there is always someone listening. It was an ordinary day in Studio 6. 30 minutes of a 90-minute drama had to be in the can by 7 o'clock. Then Amanda Jones could go home to a new episode of Blackadder and a bowl of spaghetti. Carson Dawlish put his head round the control room door just before 10. Amanda had just finished rigging the microphones. It was a modest setup, few different locations. She told her junior studio manager Keith to come in late, ready to record. Mandy, Carson heaved the soundproof door open. It's you. Always a joy to work with. Amanda took off her headphones and prepared for the Carson embrace. He was a big man, perfect for playing Henry VIII, which he'd done twice on the London stage. His bear hugs were famous. Today he moved more slowly, and Amanda recalled his gammy hip. A 6-month radio repertory company contract was perfect for him as it healed. 3 days of gentle fun. He wrapped her in a scratchy cardigan and the odor of cigars and whiskey. A lot of actors liked radio. It paid badly, but no one had to wear makeup or period costume, and there was a lot less waiting around. Miserable play, Carson remarked. I think the writers knew. Can we play jokes on him, darling? It's such fun with new folk. He's a she. And no, Carson, you can't. Darling, you temper my worst excesses. I'll see you after the read-through. Ellis Hughes dropped in before going to the green room for the read. A seasoned producer, he'd whipped the play into shape by the time recording started at 11:30. Amanda was at the sound desk making notes when Keith arrived. He was very young, only out of training for 6 months, and so eager to please that Amanda found him exhausting. He was also, she noticed, still upset. Keith had split up with his boyfriend 3 weeks ago, a charming young man in marketing. So, scene 11, Keith said immediately. He flung his anorak and bag into a corner and began prizing open new boxes of 1/4-inch audio tape. Scene 11 is a nightmare. We'll tweak it, don't worry, Amanda assured him. But acting inside a wardrobe, Keith cried. 2 of them, with coats on hangers in there, too. In every radio play was a moment that a studio manager marked in red pen. No one else, not the writer, producer, or actors, noticed its difficulty from a technical point of view. It might be a car chase, or a scene with an unlikely number of doors that let in different external noises. Amanda had learned these moments rarely go as badly as feared, but Keith would not rest easy until he'd reassured himself. It was his job to manage the practical effects in the studio. If there was a wardrobe, he had to build it. Why don't you go in before I take mic levels? She pointed at the glass that separated the control room from the huge studio. And you can set that up. Keith wheeled portable doors across the floor to make his cupboard, and gathered coat hangers and metal poles to try to construct a hanging rail. She smiled. Once he had a few more audio plays under his belt, he'd make a solid member of the team. Amanda sat back to look again at the cast, listed on the front page of the script. Laura Haddington was the female lead, dependable and skilled. Then there was Carson and Dane Ambrose in the junior male role. Dane had cut short his radio repertory company contract, tempted away to make a spy film in the U.S. He was good-looking, craggy-jawed, and beefy, and it was no surprise that Hollywood had called. The film had been unexpectedly successful. The control room door opened again and the long, horse-like face of Teddy Novak appeared. Talking of Hollywood, Amanda said softly, "Ha!" Teddy sat in the producer's chair, long legs sticking out. He'd left America 2 decades ago for London. "Oh, nothing," Amanda replied. "We've got Dane Ambrose in this play." Teddy nodded. "He's an okay actor. I saw his spy movie, totally inaccurate but diverting." "What's on your schedule today?" Amanda asked. It was a good idea to get Teddy moving. He was prone to very long chats. "I got called in because Charlotte's off sick. I have to take over producing Tracks of My Life, and it's a drag. Who have you got?" Teddy rose to his full 6 feet 4 inches. "Ah," he said, "I hate the program, famous people being self-indulgent. But today it's Vasily Myrov, the dancer, the dissident, but such a marvelous dancer." Amanda had seen him in The Nutcracker. "It is great cover, being a dancer," Teddy replied. "Cover?" This was heading into one of Teddy's conspiracy theories. He was funny about UFOs and especially the terrors of communism. Most staff in drama and features found him amusing, but he could bore for America on the topic of the Soviet Union. "Myrov was the next Nureyev when he came to London," Teddy said. "I've spoken to the guy a few times, and I think he's still one of them." "Really, Teddy? If you were the KGB and you wanted the ultimate cover story, what would you do? Who would you send?" Amanda sighed. It was easier to agree. She could see Keith through the glass, standing back from his wardrobe lash up, a roll of gaffer tape on his arm. "I think I might arrange for my guy to defect," she said. Pretend to defect." Teddy banged his hand on the producer's desk. "Exactly. It's the only reason I agreed to produce Tracks of My Life today. I can see what this Myrov is really like. See if he'll crack. Crack while listening to his favorite pop songs? He's a spy, Amanda. Talking about his past may be a strain. He'll be lying. Teddy finally left and Keith came back in. I had a job to keep my clothes rail in place, he said, but I think it's all right. The acoustic in there sounds good. Shall I rig a mic for scene 11? Later, Amanda replied. Right now I need tea. The cast will be back soon. On the way to the canteen, Amanda met Dane Ambrose. He greeted her with a cry of delight and her second cuddle of the day. Actors tended to be over the top and Dane was particularly enthusiastic. People called him Tigger, as he was always on to the next thing, talked too much, and was often indiscreet. Are you still in that flat in the Oval? Dane asked. Amanda had held a party there a couple of years ago, around Christmas of 1983, and Dane had pretty much invited himself. Still there, Amanda replied. Great, we'll have to arrange something. Dane glanced at the dingy painted brickwork and cables sagging from the ceiling. It's great to be back in radio, he said. California is adorable, but Camden Town in the rain is better? Amanda interrupted. You'd be amazed. We should meet for dinner. Tonight? No, I'm seeing my new agent. I got so much to tell you. How about that Turkish cafe over the road at lunch? I have to buy aspirin, but I'll see you there 5 minutes after we break. Aspirin? Are you okay? Amanda asked. A tiny headache. I might have been out last night. Might? At a fabulous flat owned by some foreign guy who works in Covent Garden. Somebody I was at drama school with took me along. It was all silk hangings and stuff. I've been in Hollywood, so I know a nice place when I see one. I'll tell you all about Hollywood at lunch. Amanda liked Dane, though she switched off from listening on occasion. I don't want Ellis kept waiting, she said. I'd better get my cuppa. Go. Chat later. The first scenes of the play went well. At lunchtime, they were on schedule and Ellis gave everyone an hour and a quarter break. Amanda adjusted microphones for the scene they'd be recording after lunch, while cast members chatted, deciding where to buy their sandwiches. Back in the control room, she said to Keith, bung a fresh reel on machine 1 and press record. Will you? This nattering will make a nice wild track of chat for the background of that job center scene. Okay. Keith grabbed a new box of tape. Do you know which CD those saloon car engines are on, the ones with good braking noises? Discs 28 and 29, Amanda replied. Thanks, Keith said. Work had perked him up, but she could see he was starting to brood again. The actors filtered out and Amanda left Studio 6 with Keith, satisfied with his pile of effects CDs. She went via the ladies to reception, then to the cafe to wait for Dane. Dane didn't show up. After 40 minutes she gave up and went back, hungry and annoyed. Have you seen Mr. Ambrose? She asked Malik on reception. Is he the one in the dark network? Malik asked. If so, then no. That was the title of Dane's spy blockbuster. Yeah, Amanda replied. He just stood me up. She went back to the studio, hoping there was a chocolate bar in her bag. The lights were off in the control room and studio. Amanda made her way into the studio, turning on lights as she went. She stopped, seeing what she thought was a rehearsal skirt on the parquet floor. Drama studios were full of these black nylon taffeta creations. Tied around the waists of actors, they rustled like Victorian gowns. Amanda bent to pick up the skirt and rocked on her heels in shock. The dark pool wasn't fabric. It was blood, almost purple in the low light. Lying on the dusty floor, she saw the unmistakable form of Dane Ambrose, his golden hair streaked with more blood. A stage weight lay nearby at an odd angle. Amanda stifled a sob of panic. She ran into the control room and called 999, then called the building's first aid number. But she knew there was no use in getting medical help. Dane was dead. The police came quickly, a small team led by an efficient young officer. I'm D.S. Riley. No, D.I. Riley. It's a recent promotion. Congratulations, Amanda said automatically. She was trying to process what had happened. She looked down at the script, open ready for the next scene, with Dane's name repeated down the left-hand side. He's in this scene, she said to the young policeman. He was. Already a team in pale overalls was filtering into the studio area. Amanda wondered where the actors were, and then remembered they'd been sent to the green room. In what? D.I. Riley asked. Scene 9. It might be best if you left the paperwork alone. I will be examining and labeling in there, and possibly in here, too. It was murder, then? Amanda asked. That's the working hypothesis. The team will gather evidence. What happened? We'll find that out. Now, can you take me through who was here today? Yes, I gathered that. D.I. Riley coughed. I'll be taking a statement from you. Amanda jumped. You mean I might have killed Dane? She shook her head, confused. I didn't kill him. We'll sort all this out, Amanda, he replied. He knew her name already. Felt better that he did, Amanda thought. He had a nice face, a normal face, and a smile that reassured her. She listed those present that morning, including Ellis, his assistant, and the cast. The DI went away to question them. Other officers came and went. D.I. Riley came back and escorted her to the green room to join the others. The building had been closed to anyone coming in or out, and on her way Amanda saw Teddy Novak through an office door. He looked irritable. With him sat an elegant man in a silk shirt and jeans whom she guessed was Vasily Myrov. Now deprived of talking on Tracks of My Life because all recording had been postponed. Just as Amanda was about to be ushered by D.I. Riley into the green room, a woman in her late 20s came bowling along from the lifts, her shaggy blonde perm flying. She was faintly familiar to Amanda. Where is he? She called out. Where's the swine? As the woman took a 90-degree turn to enter the green room, D.I. Riley stepped forward smartly. I'll just ask you to stop there, he said. A crime has been committed. I'll say, she exclaimed, her face pink. When a man says he loves you and you're engaged, and then he disappears off to America without thinking to mention it, I'd say that's a crime. Her East End accent grew stronger with every word. Amanda remembered who she was. Sandra Bright, one-time fiancée of Dane Ambrose, makeup artist on a soap opera. D.I. Riley seized his opportunity. America, he prompted her. Is this Mr. Ambrose we're talking about? It appeared the detective knew a bit about Dane already, or had found out. You betcha. Sandra fixed her glare on D.I. Riley. I bet you'd never do that. Breach of promise. Is that still the law? Miss he asked, moving her along gently. Sandra Bright. Sandra began to cry. Her shoulders drooped and a leopard print bag slipped to her elbow. I only came in to talk to him, my lovely Dane. I just have to know why. Amanda wondered how D.I. Riley would handle this. Sandra was one in a colorful line of fiancés whom Dane had brought along to after-parties with his customary enthusiasm. D.I. Riley composed his face. Amanda saw in it a care and a shrewdness, and realized Sandra might be a suspect. If Sandra was shown to be in the building during the crucial period, she might have come to kill him. Possibly she was murderous, hiding behind the mask of a jilted lover. Amanda tried to calculate whether or not she was a suspect herself. When exactly had Dane died? Was she in the cafe at the time? Miss Bright, D.I. Riley said. Shall we sit down? When Sandra Bright heard the news, she became hysterical. It took Amanda and D.I. Riley several minutes to calm her down. Everyone in the green room stared dully out through the glass. Laura patted Carson's hand. The others clutched mugs. Caroline Batty was chewing her hair. Another repertory company actor smoked frantically. But I loved him. Sandra sobbed. It destroyed me that he didn't care. D.I. Riley asked about her movements that day. I came in to see Ellis, she explained. I thought he'd be free. But the woman in the next office said he was in the studio. And how do you know Ellis Hughes? We worked on a soap called Henderson Road. Do you know it? It's a gritty tale of urban life set in Birmingham. We filmed it in Berkshire. 3 million viewers on Christmas Day, 1981. D.I. Riley confessed he didn't know the program. I do award-winning makeup. Ellis did an attachment in telly, and so we know each other. He's so knowledgeable. I thought I'd ask him about a career change. You can do too much makeup. The detective was calm. Miss Bright, you said that you came to speak to the victim, Mr. Ambrose. Sandra paused. That was a coincidence. I was in main reception and I heard the girls there saying Dane Ambrose was in. I'd already been given an entry thingy because Ellis had left a note to let me in. So he's back, I thought, and no word to the woman who's devoted to him. She was crying again. D.I. Riley wrote in his notebook. He took all her details, including the fact that between 1 o'clock and 10 to 2, when Amanda found the body, Sandra was apparently wandering the building unaccompanied. D.I. Riley said she could go, and then along with a detective constable went to take statements from Ellis, his PA, and the cast. He sent them home with orders to stay near a phone. Amanda felt like she had been hit by a train, but as the senior studio manager, she was in charge. "Can I offer you and your team tea?" she asked. Half of her hoped they'd refuse. The other half hoped that D.I. Riley might stay a little longer. She still had a funny tremor in her hand. "You're shaking," he said. "Tom, Pauline, you get off home and I'll wind up here." They sat in an empty canteen and after some small talk, Amanda said, "So, about me being a suspect," D.I. Riley held up a hand. "I sent Pauline to check out your movements, Miss Jones, and we can't see how you could have done it. The owner of the cafe knows you well, as does the receptionist here. Both had accurate timings for you leaving the studio, reaching the cafe and heading back. I don't think you had time to kill a man and raise that alarm in the 2 minutes you had at your disposal. Now, your colleague, is it Keith? He also has—" "Oh, poor Keith. Where is he?" Amanda cried. "In your office, but on his way out. Tom will send Keith home with instructions about staying in touch. We think he has an alibi. He told Tom he spoke to his sister in Blackpool on an internal office phone from the moment he left the studio until he returned. When you raised the alarm. Once we've looked at phone logs, we'll call him. Anyway, about you," D.I. Riley went on. "Keith confirms when you left the studio. He also saw you pass from the ladies' loo to your lunch. I'm not looking at you. Sorry? I'm not looking at you for the crime, Miss Jones." They both looked away, embarrassed. A new shiver passed up Amanda's spine. "I like Dane," she said. "He was a bit much the sort of actor who brags. He was immature but not a bad man." "This is awful, D.I. Riley. I'm your point of contact." D.I. Riley pulled out a business card. "Call me any time. You might as well call me Fraser. I think I'll be around for a while and this is your patch, so—" "Fraser. Okay. When can I use Studio 6 again?" "Not until we say it's no longer a crime scene." The whole building was speculating about what happened to Dane. Producers and actors paused outside Studio 6 with its yellow tape, shaking their heads and reminiscing about TV crime series they'd worked on. They made helpful comments to visiting police and technicians, using as much jargon as they could muster. Soko popped up a lot, as did forensics. Teddy went about tooting until Amanda could bear it no longer. "What, Teddy?" she asked in the canteen. He was sitting like Rodin's thinker, with a hand to his brow and letting an Earl Grey go cold. "They haven't considered the thing that is staring them in the face," Teddy whispered. "We're alone, Teddy. You can talk normally." Amanda sat eyeing the fried bread at the hot counter, which was crisp now but would be soggy soon. That communist was in on the same day. I said so to the detective inspector, and he looked at me skeptically. She sighed. "Tell me, but I have to edit a reading in 10 minutes. Let's assume Vasily Myrov is a Soviet agent. Must we? He just happens to be here on the day of Ambrose's death. You do know Ambrose attended a party at Myrov's apartment?" "Oh!" Amanda tried to recall her conversation with Dane. He'd mentioned a party and a host who worked in Covent Garden. Vasily Myrov danced at the Royal Opera House regularly. "How do you know about that?" she asked. They acknowledged each other in the corridor that day. Then, while my studio manager for the stupid music program was taking a level from Myrov's microphone, he said Dane had been at his party. Teddy leaned closer. "You knew Dane Ambrose, a talkative, presumptuous type. I've been at house parties with him, too. I've seen him poking in kitchen drawers, putting on women's coats to draw attention, all that stuff. So, think about it. He's at this party, he rummages around and sees something that makes him think, or understand, that Vasily Myrov is more than a principal dancer. You think Myrov nipped into Studio 6 during our lunch break and threw a weight at Dane?" Amanda asked. He was here very early 4 tracks of my life and was a free agent in the building. Amanda made a mental note to review visitor arrangements. Teddy continued. I let him in at reception and bought him coffee, but then I had to review the script in my office. He said he was going on the roof to get some air. He shrugged. Why not wait until Dane is free? Lure him back into Studio 6 and kill him? If so, why acknowledge Dane in the corridor? Maybe at that moment he hadn't planned it. Until today, he didn't even know Dane was in the building. Well, I didn't see Myrov anywhere near Studio 6. That doesn't prove he wasn't there, Teddy pointed out. Let's see if there's any evidence, Teddy, Amanda told Fraser, who listened attentively. There's always the possibility of political motives, he admitted. At the Met, we have to keep that in mind. I'll talk to this Myrov. The thing is, Amanda replied, in my exchange with Dane that morning, he was casual about the party. He could barely recall the man who invited him. He certainly didn't know the name of the host, unless he was being careful, aware of the implications of talking freely and planning what action to take, Fraser suggested. Having said that, he added, it's rare for spies to leave evidence of their work lying about. Fraser asked if Amanda thought Dane was the sort of man to get involved if he suspected treason. Dane mostly liked to go shopping and talk about himself, but then Amanda remembered something. Have you seen Agent in Siberia? She asked. It was a TV series. Dane played an MI6 agent. He said he'd be great at Secret Service work because he could act. I didn't point out he only got 4.0 levels. Fraser smiled. So not Secret Service material, but he'd like to have been. Look, Fraser, you need to talk to Teddy Novak. He thinks Myrov is a spy. Leave it with me, Fraser told her. If Myrov murdered Dane to keep him quiet, there will be avenues we can explore. And if Mr. Novak has made it all up, I'll arrest him for wasting police time. He grinned. Only joking. Cast members began calling Amanda. They were at a loose end and jumpy. Caroline Batty called first. You hear about people with vendettas. What if this killer comes for us? Caroline had once had an affair with Teddy Novak and they had competed in their catastrophizing. I don't think so, Caroline, Amanda replied. There's bound to be a far less interesting explanation. It could have been one of us, of course, Caroline pointed out. Actors and their hot tempers. Stephen hated Dane after Dane got engaged to his ex-girlfriend. Stephen Harris was the actor who smoked. Dane was engaged to most people's ex-girlfriends at one time or another. Amanda returned. There's a wide potential field. Still. Then there's Macy. She has such a temper. She only eats 12 calories a day and would be unable to throw a weight. She went home at noon. She'd done all her scenes. Caroline whimpered. Carson, darling Carson, was a bit tired of Dane going on about Hollywood. Well, we all were. Carson, jealous? Amanda exclaimed. He's got rows of awards. Caroline, make some Horlicks and get some sleep. Okay. That handsome policeman is talking to all of us again in the morning. Amanda put the phone down. Fraser was handsome. But did she only like him because he made her feel safe? Fraser interviewed Sandra Bright again the next day. Amanda met him in reception. You know Miss Bright? He asked her. Barely. She's got motive. Simple revenge. Yes. Was all that wild emotion for show? Did she get in, kill Dane, then fly into fake hysteria when we told her he was dead? It was an Oscar-winning performance if she did, Amanda replied. She'd have had access to the studio. Everyone signed in that day had access. She knew Ellis, and he signed her in. Ellis Hughes has an alibi that holds up. He had lunch with the head of drama, and the head's PA confirms the timings, similar to yours. We've ruled him out, and he confirmed Sandra Bright did ask to talk to him about a career change. I've just remembered, Amanda said. Ellis has a thing for Sandra Bright. When he talked about the soap they were on, it was all about her. He's pretty transparent. Do you think he might have backed Sandra up, even if he knew she had another reason to be here? Fraser asked. It's unlikely. He's a good bloke. And Sandra's all mouth, I reckon. Even so, I think she was giving some sort of performance. Fraser took out his notebook. You should try policing. And give up 12-hour days with no windows and a team of insecure prima donnas? I don't think so. I'd love to know more, though, she admitted. We should go for a burger sometime. Fraser looked surprised. Why not? When we know what happened to Dane, that would be nice. 3 days later, Keith came to find Amanda in the studio manager's office. He stood by the shared desk for a good minute before he said, "Was it me? Was what you, Keith? Did I cause Dane's death? You saw me rig up that wardrobe. I was distracted that day. I wonder if maybe it wasn't murder at all, that the weight I taped on top." "What weight?" Amanda stood up. "What did you use a weight for?" "I couldn't get a pole to stay in place with coat hangers on. Kept rolling. So I taped a stage weight to one end. Surely they know the weight was dropped on Dane deliberately?" Amanda replied, but she wasn't sure. She was struggling to recall how the scene had looked when she found Dane. If Keith's hanging rail creation had collapsed, the police might not know it existed. If Dane had disturbed it. "This is awful," Keith said in a panicked voice. Amanda felt sorry for him. "An accident sounds very unlikely to me," she said. "Will you find out for me, Amanda? What they know about the weight?" "Yes. Go home, Keith. Get some rest. I'll call you." Fraser came to tell Amanda that she could have Studio 6 back. "I'm sorry about all the dust," he said. "You'll find a film of fingerprint powder everywhere." She thought of Keith. "Are you allowed to tell me about the prints?" "None from the studio are on our records," Fraser replied. "The few on the weight were smudged. Someone wiped it." Amanda tried to recall that day. She saw Keith in her mind's eye, a half-used roll of gaffer tape over his arm. If the weight had fallen from his lash-up swathed in tape, those could be Keith's prints on it. If he'd caused the death of Dane Ambrose, what would happen to him? Amanda knew she ought to tell Fraser about the wardrobe rig. But he was speaking again. "Could you show me round the studio from a technical point of view?" "Sure." She took him first to the control room. "You've got 6 CD players and 3 gramophones?" Fraser asked, looking around. "And 4 reel-to-reel tape machines?" "Yes." "Is this relevant?" "No," Fraser smiled. "I've just always wanted to know. My mum loves The Archers." He paced round, looking adorably like an old-time policeman with his hands behind his back. "This one's got the tape all on the left-hand spool. That's a brand new reel, ready to roll. Keith normally records on that machine. It was set up for recording the next scene after lunch. They hold 30 minutes. Fraser stopped. "But on this machine, all the tape is on the right." "Oh," Amanda frowned. "Ah, I remember now. I set it recording a wild track. Both of us forgot to stop it when we left for lunch." "What's a wild track?" "We often need a recording of our cast of actors for background noise. It might be a crowd at a fair, or distant chatter in a cafe. That lunchtime, I rolled that tape to capture the cast chatting on. I must have got distracted." Fraser scratched his chin. "So on there is the first half of the lunch hour. Whatever was going on in the studio when it was supposedly empty?" Amanda stared at him. "Well, yes. Most of the first half hour. May I listen? It looks as if no one in my team has done that yet." Of course, Amanda hurried over. Too long had passed without her mentioning Keith's confession, and she was becoming agitated. Fumbling and distracted, she laced the end of the magnetic tape back across the play and record heads and secured it on the left spool. Then she rewound the tape at speed. There, she pressed stop seconds from the start of the tape. "Press there to play. I'll leave you to it, D.I. Riley. Call me if you need anything." Half an hour later, Amanda crept back in. Fraser had his eyes closed. The reel of quarter-inch tape was all back on the right-hand side. "That was scintillating," he said. "Not a sound. Well, a faint hiss. Tape noise. Actually, you'd have heard the silence of the studio. 2. I had a stereo mic wide open. I think I did faint rumbles. Tube trains. We're near the Metropolitan line." Amanda waited a moment before she said, "That stage weight?" "It's in there," Fraser replied. "It came back from forensics. They put it back on the stairs from where we believe it was thrown." "It was thrown from the stairs?" "We can't be sure, but that's the hypothesis based on angles and impact." Do weights like that often have black tape all over them? Amanda took a deep breath. I wanted to mention something, she said. Then she told the tale. 10 minutes later, they were back in the studio and Fraser was re-examining the remains of Keith's wardrobe. Portable doors made into a 3-sided chamber, and a metal pole that lay on the floor. You can see gaffer tape glue still up there on the lintels, he pointed out. My guys established that the weight probably originated from here. We had no idea that it was meant to be a wardrobe. I'll get the science girls and boys back in now that we can reconstruct the wardrobe and reposition that pole. Thanks. Keith's lovely, Amanda told him. Fraser turned to her. His expression was neutral, a police officer on duty. I'll let you know, he replied. Amanda was relieved to find she was booked for 2 days in an edit suite, trimming a sitcom recorded weeks before. It wasn't funny, but its producer thought it was, which made the edit more tiresome, but Amanda made it through the first half day. Slicing through the tape with her razor blade, as lengths of dark brown tape fell to the floor, she thought of Dane. Then she thought about Keith and of Vasily Myrov, who might have murdered Dane thinking Dane might unmask him, and Sandra Bright, who was so angry. They didn't seem like killers, but what did she know? Who else had the opportunity? Any of the cast might have slipped back in. But not for half an hour, she said aloud. What did you say? The producer asked. A silly woman called Brenda who had a special skill in cutting the best jokes out of her programs. Nothing, Amanda lied. She was thinking of that fatal lunch hour. Fraser had deduced from the empty half-hour reel that nothing had happened for 30 minutes. Dane must have been brought back in later. Who would have done that? Is it 1 o'clock yet? She inquired. Not enjoying episode 5? Brenda asked archly. I just remembered an errand, Amanda replied. Brenda agreed on an early lunch and Amanda telephoned Fraser. It's not my business, she said, but that half hour? I know, he replied. I've been wondering, too. Why wait to bring Dane in and kill him if there was the intention? It was a risk. Yes, people wander back into studios as breaks go on. Keith often comes back early to use the piano. She wished immediately that she hadn't said that. Fraser might be imagining Keith anchoring that weight badly, and a collapse and Dane underneath. I'm on my way in, Fraser told her. Can I buy you a coffee in the canteen? I'll buy staff discount, but no coffee. It's horrible. 3 members of the radio rep were in the canteen when they got there, among them Carson. Repertory actors were given parts in anything being recorded, including features programs and announcements. Carson looked dejected. Seeing Amanda, he gave her a sympathetic smile. Bearing up, darling? He asked as she passed him. Yeah, just about. Chin up. Laura here was asking if the police have got anywhere. I'm not sure, but I've got D.I. Riley here. Fraser was investigating the tea bags. Carson waved. We wish we could help. Laura shook her head sadly. You know, Carson and I could both have done it. I was reading on the roof and he was wandering the streets smoking. I was trying to get a voiceover right. Looking like a madman, Carson explained. Stephen Harris laughed. I believe that, he said. You are bonkers. You should give your leer at the old Vic one of these days. Carson grinned. Too lame, darling. Mandy, your divine policeman will be making sure Laura and I were seen. I imagine. I've left my bag in the edit suite. Amanda patted her pockets. Laura reached for her purse, but kind old Carson got in first. Here, you're good for £1, he said with a smile. Fraser came over as Carson opened a large leather wallet with a zip. You've got a chinograph in there. Amanda cried. You cheeky blighter. Have I? Amanda reached in, pulled out a pencil and showed Fraser its white lead. These are like gold dust, she told him. No studio or suite ever has enough. We mark the start and end of the bit of audio we want to cut out of the tape. Some hoard them and actors mistake them for pencils to mark scripts with, Carson interrupted. His jovial laugh rolled round the canteen. Have it, darling. I promise not to do it again. Steve laughed. We also pinch each other's biscuits. It's a hotbed of petty crime. The glamour of broadcasting. Over tea, Fraser told Amanda that there was no way Dane could have been killed by a stage weight falling from the metal pole. It wouldn't have had the momentum, he said. The lab is in no doubt. Thank goodness, Amanda replied. I'll go and ring Keith. Then could you meet me in Studio 6? Sure. We're finally using it again. Some afternoon playset during the Russian Revolution. They set off walking from the canteen. Talk of Russians? Any news on Vasily Myrov? Fraser shrugged. He has no alibi. He just insists he's no spy, didn't know Dane Ambrose, and I am ruining his artistic flow. Do you believe him? I suppose I do, but then if he was a spy, he'd be good at denying it. Where are we going for that burger? Amanda felt her spirits lift. If you clear up this ghastly death, I'll pick a place, she responded. For now, I'll see you outside the studio in 20 minutes later, they were pushing open the studio door. No one is here. They're all. Amanda swallowed. At lunch? It's okay, Fraser replied. You will feel odd in her for a bit. It'll pass. The front part of the studio, below the stairs, was set up for a domestic scene with soft chairs around a low microphone. Fraser strode to the stairs and climbed halfway up. What are you doing? Amanda asked. Yes, I can see it, he said. Curious, she followed him. Is that how you'd usually have the lights? He asked. Yes, the tape machine you let me play. I can see it from here. We know the murderer stood here, so he or she could see it. She fixed her gaze on the machine behind the glass. You think they saw it was recording what they were doing? She felt cold. He sighed. But there was nothing on the tape. He ran down the stairs, picked up a stage weight, kicked off his shoes and carried the weight back up. I can be almost silent doing that, he said. But what if I then drop it on a passing actor? The impact could be quietish, maybe, but the weight hitting the parquet. Go on, Amanda prompted him. I take responsibility for any dents in the floor. Fraser let the weight fall, aiming for an armchair below in lieu of a person. It bounced off, hit the wood with a dull, splintering sound, ricocheted off and rolled before hitting a door. Nothing like that was on the tape, he said. They wandered into the studio and perched on the producer's desk. Is that the same tape? Amanda asked. It was on the machine on which Fraser had played it. Yeah. It has a little dent in the metal spool. Amanda examined it. It can't be the same one. No, it is. I wrote the case number on it with one of those white pencils. You'll find the number on every bit of evidence and paper I'm allowed to touch. Amanda picked up the spool, frowning. But it's short, she said. By 5 minutes, maybe, came a voice from the door. It was Keith. I live round the corner, he told Fraser. I'm working on this play this afternoon and tomorrow. He smiled widely. I feel like I have a life again. He walked over and took the spool from Amanda, hugged her, then stepped back with the reel in his hand. There aren't 30 minutes of tape on here, he declared. But it was a new reel that day, Amanda said. Fraser peered at it. Where could the missing section have gone? The studio's been cleared since, and the bins have been emptied, Keith told him. Is this important? They explained about the wild track and he whistled. So whoever killed Dane might have whipped off the incriminating section of audio and destroyed it? I need that piece of audio, Fraser said. The cast of the play was coming back in, so they left Keith to his work. Fraser went back to the station, arranging to pick up Amanda at 6. The murder's not solved, so no burger, he said. But there was no mention in our deal of a quick beer. At the end of the following day, Keith came to find Amanda. He held up a small plastic spool. We did a final scene for the Russian Revolution play, set in a woodland at night. The whole cast was in it, bayonets, clinking horse brasses, the works. So I go in with the actors to do the practical sound effects. Fraser arrived wearing jeans and a casual shirt. Keith gave Amanda an inquiring look and smiled. Keep talking, Amanda told him. The producer comes across on the talkback. The undergrowth isn't making any noise. Amanda leapt from her chair. A new tape. Can someone explain? Fraser asked. Sorry, Amanda said. We have buckets of used tape in each studio. Scrunch tape makes the noise of leaves and twigs when you walk in it. It's amazing. Keith fitted the small spool to a nearby machine. Show him, Amanda, he said. Amanda dashed out and returned with handfuls of crinkled quarter-inch tape. She dropped it to the floor. Walk, she ordered him. Fraser paced on the spot and his face lit up. "It sounds just like that," Amanda went on. "We need old tape, stuff we've recorded on too often. We play it onto the floor and chuck it in the tape bins." Keith had now laced up the small spool. "This stuff was new. I wound it back on to this mini reel. Have you listened to it yet?" Amanda asked. "I decided to wait until you could hear it." "And your favorite detective?" Fraser coughed. "If there's something on here, can I prove when it happened?" Amanda shook her head. "Okay, play it anyway," Fraser said. What they heard, in clear stereo, was a terrible drama enacted between a man and his victim. It was short but intense, anger building in one man while another defended himself, said that he was overreacting, urged that they talk it through. Then it was just the final, shocking sounds, a terrifying thud, a body falling, a man lumbering away, the suck of a soundproof door opening and closing, then silence. "I think I can make an arrest," Fraser declared. "Put that tape in a plastic bag." Poor Dane Ambrose had been too much of a bouncy Tigger for his own good. He bragged to every actor he met about the Hollywood life and VIPs he met at actor hangouts. Most took it with a pinch of salt. But Carson Dawlish was not in a good place, and Dane was too much for him. Fraser allowed Amanda to accompany him to Carson's flat. On the way, still shocked, she mulled over Carson's situation. There was a time when he loved his job on the humble radio repertory company, she said, but I think his advancing age must be a burden. It's an occupational hazard with actors, but only if they're vain and insecure. Carson exuded bonhomie, but he was a mass of insecurities. His bad hip limited what he could do. It was terrible for him. In her statement, Lara said she'd noticed Carson being distant with Dane. "He's so good at playing the charming thespian. He's a good actor, that's the irony. We loved him." I'm guessing that Dane's harping about his own shiny future and Carson finally lost control. They had reached Carson's apartment and Fraser rang the bell. Carson's delighted smile fell into a look of misery when he saw Fraser's face. He led them upstairs. "I didn't mean it to happen," he told them. "We met in the gents and he was so smug. He said he'd left his new agent's number in Studio 6 and was going to nip back for it. He had to chat to her about another movie. So I followed. I just meant to suggest he stop being such an idiot." But he kept on and on. "I saw red." Carson dropped on to a sofa. "I saw a weight above my eye level, but it stuck when I reached for it. Someone had taped it to the bloody door. That would have stopped me in my tracks. But Dane threw in a comment about which roles I can play now I'm chubby. Did you remove evidence from a recording tape?" Fraser asked. "So you found that?" "Yes, I saw that wild track going round. I knew someone might listen to it." "The Chinograph pencil," Amanda said. "I must have shoved it in my bag without thinking." Carson laughed weakly. "In case I ever needed to edit a tape again." He looked at her. "Yes, I can edit, not very well, but I have been in radio a long time. I thought of taking the whole tape, but the things are enormous. I thought my idea of the undergrowth bin was pretty nifty." Carson never acted again. Sandra Bright admitted she'd been giving a performance. She wanted money from Dane Ambrose. She had come to the building to make a scene, aware that he needed a squeaky clean image now that he was a rising screen star. Ellis Hughes didn't seem to mind. He and Sandra got engaged shortly after Carson's trial. Vasily Myrov wasn't a spy. He was offended by the suggestion and would not contribute to Tracks of My Life. Teddy was happy about that and persisted in his belief that the dancer was a foreign agent, even when Vasily was made an OBE for services to dance. Amanda got engaged, too, a year after the terrible events in Studio 6. These days, when making crime drama, she asks her handsome policeman husband for technical advice. Removing the statue would be like trying to erase part of the town's history, they claimed. Privately, Detective Inspector Elise Sharma felt some sympathy for the Remove campaigners, but kept her views to herself. The job of the police was to maintain public order, and that was what she was currently focusing on. At a recent stormy meeting, the council had voted to have the statue removed from Horville Park and placed in the museum. And that afternoon, the removal was taking place. "Save our statue," voices shouted from one side. They were matched by chants of "slavery out." all backed by a cacophony of drums, hooters, and whistles. "I should have brought earplugs," Elise muttered. There was plenty of noise, but no real attempt to stop the removal of the statue. The crowd had been kept well away from the plinth, so the workmen could go about their business. "I'll be glad when this is done," PC Colin McFarlane muttered next to her. "This statue has caused nothing but trouble for months." It was true, Elise thought. Since the controversy blew up, barely a week had gone by without some stunt around the statue. Once it was in the museum, perhaps that would mean one less problem for the police. She winced as the anti-statue campaigners started blowing their whistles. The pro-statue protesters responded with hooters. But then the noise began to die down again. The workmen had removed the bolts fixing the statue to the concrete plinth, and chains from a crane were attached to it. The statue was about to be lifted into the air. Everything seemed to be happening very slowly. "Get on with it," someone shouted, causing laughter from both sides. The chains gradually tightened and then, to a mix of cheers and boos, the statue rose into the air. The crane turned gradually and lowered it on to a waiting flatbed lorry. "Good riddance," came a yell amid the relative quiet. That was a sign for both sides to get back to their shouting and chanting. Before long, the statue was secured on the lorry and attention turned to removing the plinth. Somehow, the removal of the statue had altered the atmosphere. Those calling for the statue to stay in place realized they weren't going to have their way. It seemed to Elise that the protest was coming to a natural conclusion. The passion on both sides had been spent and people's minds were turning to heading home. But at that moment a piercing scream rang out. Elise heard a voice in her earpiece. "D.I. Sharma, this is PC McFarlane. I'm at the plinth. You need to get here now." Elise made her way quickly along the line of police officers, trying not to appear to be rushing. The scream was followed by a growing noise from the crowd, which sounded urgent and concerned. The plinth hung about 10 feet in the air, swaying slightly from the chains. Colin's face had a look of serious concern. There was no need for an explanation, for Elise had turned to the square of earth from which the plinth had been lifted. There, partly buried, was the unmistakable sight of a human skeleton. The chief inspector had called Elise back to the station to give a report. He frowned at her. "So, the protesters have gone?" Elise nodded. Once the statue and the plinth were taken away on the lorry, the focus for the protest left with them. "Is the area where the statue stood secured?" the inspector asked. "That was our first task," Elise said. "It's being treated as a potential crime scene. A few folk are hanging around, but there's nothing much for them to see." "What about the media?" A rueful look crossed Elise's face. "There are plenty of them there," she replied. The protest had generated a lot of interest anyway. When rumors spread about possible human remains being found, that only attracted more. "But I've made it clear to the officers on site that no information should be given to the media other than through official channels." The chief inspector nodded. "It's vital that we keep a lid on media interest in this case," he said. "The last thing we need is for more fuss to be caused by these remains." "I'm afraid they are human remains, Chief," Elise said. "They were partially buried. But I saw enough to be clear that it was someone's skeleton under the plinth." The chief inspector shook his head. "Then we definitely need to damp down the media excitement," he stated. "I'll keep tomorrow's briefing low-key. I'll say they are clearly ancient remains of historical interest only." "We can't be sure of that at the moment," Elise said. "Of course they are. Andrew Horville's statue has been in place for 150 years. 156, Elise murmured. "In that case, even if there was something suspicious about the death, it's hardly a recent crime." Elise frowned. She didn't like to make assumptions before the evidence was collected. "I'm putting you in charge of this," the inspector said. "Right you are, Chief. Go through the motions, complete your investigation, and file a report. It's an open and shut case, so it shouldn't take long." Elise said nothing. She took pride in her work and never simply went through the motions with an investigation. This case would take as long as it required. "If that's all, I'd like to get back to the scene," she said. "I want to see what preliminary results Martin Hunter and the forensic team have come up with." "You do that," he said. I'll organize the press briefing myself. No need to take you away from your work. Elise stifled a smile. When it came to the media, the chief inspector liked to be front and center. That suited Elise perfectly. Back at the park, it was early evening and a dozen or so people were gathered round the roped-off area. Some were journalists whom she recognized. They hurried over, full of questions. Elise shook her head. A constable lifted the crime scene tape to let her through. A mobile lighting system was being set up. Elise had a quick word with the person in charge, then headed for the tent that had been put up over the site of the statue. She stood for a moment taking in the scene. Four members of the forensic science team were kneeling on the ground. Martin Hunter, the chief forensic science officer, stood up when he saw her. An interesting case. He smiled. Not too interesting, I hope, Elise replied. In her experience, interesting cases meant complicated cases. The remains appear to be those of an adult male, Martin explained. The skeleton is mainly intact, but a lot of the bones are fractured. That was possibly caused by the weight of the plinth and the statue. What about a cause of death? Elise asked. Initial indications are that it was a heavy blow to the back of the head. So, a possible murder? Martin nodded. What age are the remains? We found fragments of clothing, Martin revealed. They suggest the victim was buried 40 to 50 years ago. Elise's eyes widened. This happened in living memory? That's what seems to be indicated, Martin said. Elise sighed. The chief's open and shut case was already starting to creak open again. Elise returned to the statue site next morning. The skeleton had been removed and Martin was now examining the remains back at the station. A single forensic science officer remained, sifting through the earth with a trowel and a metal sieve. Are you looking for anything in particular? Elise asked. The officer looked round. Not really. I'm just ensuring we haven't missed any smaller items which might be buried deeper. A constable opened the flap of the tent. D.I. Sharma. There's someone here to see you. Elise saw a woman standing on the other side of the crime scene tape. Professor Akoli, I presume? She called. She had contacted the history department at the university and asked to speak to someone who could give background on Andrew Horville's life. Professor Ngozi Akoli had offered to meet her at the site of the statue. The two found a bench nearby. Professor Akoli turned to Elise. So what was it that you wanted to know? Just some background really on Andrew Horville and why a statue of him has stood in this park for so long, Elise replied. Professor Akoli smiled. It's not just the statue, she said. The grounds of the park itself were purchased by funds left after his death. He was one of the town's greatest benefactors. The professor outlined Andrew Horville's story. He had lived in the 17th and 18th century and was something of a merchant adventurer. He began trading in gold, silver, and ivory from Africa, but increasingly he turned to selling slaves. Over the years, his ships transported tens of thousands of people to the Caribbean to work on plantations. He became immensely rich, the professor continued. He moved back, settled here, and was soon elected mayor. Has the statue always been in the same place? That was the central question in Elise's mind. How had remains from recent times ended up under a century-old statue? Professor Akoli nodded. The statue was placed there in 1867 and hasn't moved since, she said. Until yesterday, of course. That's not completely true, a voice stated. Elise had been vaguely aware of a man gradually wandering into earshot. He was probably in his late 60s, she thought. Professor Akoli looked at the man curiously. You're saying it has been moved? The man nodded. When was this? Elise asked sharply. If true, this could make a significant difference to her investigation. 1977, the man replied. The year of the late Queen's Silver Jubilee. I'm Rhys Oldroyd. I'm a roofer, mostly retired now. But back then, I was just a young lad starting out in the building business. I worked for Justin O'Neill. You may have heard of him. Elise nodded. Over the years, the local developer had been involved in a number of significant building projects in the town and elsewhere. Anyway, Rhys went on, it was Jubilee year and the Queen was going to visit and host a public reception in Horville Park. So the council decided to spruce it up a bit. We were taken on to repaint some walls in the park, and the statue was taken away for cleaning. It was weird to see the concrete plinth there without the statue on top. I remember it well. Reese hurried through the park. He was late for work and he knew that Tony Farrell, the supervisor, would rage at him. He would have run, but his head was banging like a hammer on an anvil. The football game the day before had been brilliant and Reese had scored a cracker of a goal. But the celebrations had gone on late and he was still feeling the after effects. Not for the first time, he vowed to cut down on drinking in future, especially when he had an 8-hour shift next day. There were 7 of them in the squad and they'd been doing different jobs around the park for the past few days. Young and unskilled, Reese tended to end up with the heavy lifting work. Not that he minded. Tony kept them hard at it, but the blokes were a good laugh and they had fun. He stopped by the empty statue plinth and waited. The guys were scattered here and there and Tony was giving each of them their instructions. With a bit of luck, he wouldn't notice that Reese had turned up late. He put his bag of tools on the plinth and stretched. As he waited, something caught his attention. The statue's concrete plinth was a plain, solid structure sunk into the ground. But it was odd. The grass in the park was cut regularly and kept tidy, but there were a few weeds growing round the base of the plinth. None was more than about 6 inches high, but it seemed to Reese that some had been disturbed. He stepped back to get a better look. There was loose earth along the edge of the plinth, and the roots of some weeds were exposed. He made his way round the structure. It was the same on the other sides. It was as if the plinth had been lifted and set down. "What time do you call this?" Tony Farrell was striding over. "Sorry about that, Tony," Reese apologized. "I forgot to set the alarm." "I'm not interested in your excuses," Tony said. "We have 2 days to finish the work in the park and we're already behind. Now go and unload the bags of cement from the van and be quick about it." Reese pointed to the base of the plinth. "Have you seen this? It looks as if the plinth has been moved," he said. Tony's face flushed red. "What are you talking about?" he asked. "It's true. The earth has been disturbed." And that was when Tony went on a furious rant. Reese listened to him open-mouthed. As supervisors went, Tony was pretty decent. He made sure everyone in the squad did a proper day's work to a high standard. But in general, he was fair as well. It was unlike him to be cursing and swearing. Reese saw no point in trying to defend himself. "Sorry, Tony. I'll go and unload that cement, will I?" Reese looked at Elise and Professor Akoli and shrugged. "And that was that," he finished. "I got on with my work and nothing more was said about the plinth. But it seemed clear to me that it had been moved and I couldn't work it out. It nagged at me at the time, but life went on and I forgot all about it. That is until I heard about human remains being found there." Elise drove back to the station, her mind churning. It was a small incident from over 45 years ago recalled by someone who, by his own admission, had been tired and hungover. How much faith could she put in such a statement? Elise pressed the doorbell and stepped back. It was a very fancy house. Justin O'Neill had obviously done well for himself in life. The door was opened by a man in brown slacks and a pale blue cardigan. There was a chunky gold ring on his finger and his leather shoes had a designer look about them. This was Justin O'Neill. Elise held out her identity badge. "Good morning, Mr. O'Neill," she greeted him. "I'm D.I. Elise Sharma. Could I have a word with you?" A slight frown crossed his tanned features. "Is there a problem, D.I. Sharma?" he asked. "You may have heard of the remains found under the statue of Andrew Horville recently." "I did. I'm in charge of the investigation," Elise said. "You think I can help?" "I just need some background to a particular aspect of the investigation. It shouldn't take long." "Come in, then." He shrugged and stood back. He led Elise to a spacious lounge and offered refreshments. She declined politely. "Do you recall some work that your company did in Horville Park in the summer of 1977? Elise inquired. He blinked. "In 1977? It was the year of the Queen's Silver Jubilee," Elise specified. He laughed lightly. "I'm aware of that, Detective Inspector," he said. "I'm just struggling to remember a particular building job my company did 46 years ago. As I understand it, one aspect of the work was repairing walls in the park." Justin frowned. Now you say that, I do remember it vaguely, he said. It was a job for the council. At the time, I was just vacuuming up all their small contracts by offering highly competitive rates. That way, I hoped to move on to some of their more significant projects. Something that he had done very successfully, Elise thought. So what is it about this job that you wanted to know, Detective Inspector? He asked. Do you recall if the plinth of Andrew Horville's statue was moved as part of that work? A look of amusement crossed his face. I haven't the faintest idea, he admitted. My role in the company was developing the business and negotiating new contracts. I had very little to do with the actual work. Back in the 70s, that was all overseen by Tony Farrell. There was a sudden frenetic yapping as a little terrier rushed in. Tony Farrell? Why are you talking about Tony Farrell? A voice asked. Elise got to her feet. It was partly to avoid the terrier, which seemed very interested in her shoes, but also because a blonde woman had just come in. Elise recognized her from photos she had seen earlier. Justin's wife, Corinne. She gazed at Elise and Justin introduced her. Darling, this is Detective Inspector Sharma, he said. Corinne's eyes grew suddenly cold. Police? Should you be speaking to the police without your lawyer here? Justin burst out laughing. Goodness, I'm not being interviewed, he said. D.I. Sharma is just here to get some background. She's investigating the case of the remains found under the statue of Andrew Horville. Corinne looked shocked. What does that have to do with you? She asked. Or with Tony Farrell? Elise explained about the work being done in the park at the time of the late Queen's Silver Jubilee. It's been suggested that while that work was going on, the plinth was moved. Who suggested that? Corinne asked sharply. It has come up during the investigation, Elise said. Do you know if that would have happened as part of the work, Mr. O'Neill? He lifted his hands. I really have no idea. But my secretary never threw away anything, he added thoughtfully. I wonder if I could dig up some paperwork from the time. He hurried away. There was a moment of silence. Did you work for your husband's company, Mrs. O'Neill? Elise asked. Certainly not. Perhaps this Tony Farrell will remember something about the work. Tony died 10 years ago this month, Corinne returned. I'm sorry to hear that, Elise murmured. She thought of asking about the circumstances of the death, but Corinne had turned to the window. She didn't seem to be in a mood for questions. Just then, her husband returned with a book. I found this, he announced. It's the company diary for 1977. It turns out I was in London at the time the work was being done in the park. I was trying to finalize some contracts there. It's no wonder my memory of the events is a bit vague. Little more came from the interview, and it was a thoughtful Elise who drove back to the police station. She wasn't sure if she'd learned anything of use, but then her phone rang. It was Martin. Could you drop by the lab when you have a moment, Elise? He said. There's something here that you need to see. I've completed the examination of the remains, Martin told her. And was it murder? She asked. It certainly looks that way, he replied. The death was caused by a heavy blow to the skull. It's hard to see how it could have been an accident. But that's not why I called you. I may have identified the victim. Elise's eyes widened. Martin brought out a photo taken at the autopsy. It showed a bone, part of which was covered by a small cylindrical sleeve. What am I looking at? Elise frowned. It's an ulna, he explained, one of the long bones in the forearm. It had been broken a year or two before the victim's death, and that sleeve you can see is called an ulnar clip. It's there to strengthen the bone. And that has helped you identify the victim? You've been very fortunate, Elise, Martin told her. Few of these particular ulnar clips were used in practice. There was a problem with the material, and they were withdrawn after a very short period. Were records kept of the patients they were fitted to? She questioned. Better than that. Each of the clips was numbered. Martin lifted a sheet of paper from his desk. This particular one was fitted to a 20-year-old man in the hospital here in town on May 12, 1975. Do you have a name for him? Elise asked eagerly. I do, Martin replied. He was Duncan Ferguson. No address, unfortunately. He's down here as NFA, no fixed abode. He looked at Elise apologetically. That might make it more tricky for you. Don't apologize, Elise said. This is a fantastic step forward. Thank you. Back at her desk, Elise logged onto her computer. She was confident the system would track down this Duncan Ferguson. If he had been homeless, then it was likely he had come in contact with the police at some point. It was as she had hoped. The system quickly came up with a hit. Duncan Ferguson was a young man with a record. Theft, burglary, breaking and entering, public drunkenness. He had clearly been well known to police at the time. Elise looked at his photograph. It looks as if you're the man we've been looking for, she murmured. She read through the long list of charges. It seemed he had come to the police's attention for one thing or another every few weeks. It had never been for anything particularly serious. He had been given the occasional jail sentence, but only for short periods. Then Elise came across an account of Duncan being involved in a fight. His arm was injured and he was taken to hospital. The dates coincided with the time the ulnar clip had been fitted. "You are our man," she said in satisfaction. Often in cases like these, it was never discovered whose the remains were. She continued to check the records. Duncan Ferguson was booked by police for various incidents up to June 12, 1977. And then it stopped. The file had nothing further. As if he just disappeared, Elise murmured. For decades, the refuge had supported homeless people in the town. It was both a night shelter and advice center. Elise dropped in to see Candace Palmer, the senior manager. She explained some of the background of the case. Candace laughed. It was 46 years ago. That was before most staff here were even born. Do you keep any records from those days? Elise asked. Candace shook her head. To be honest, she said, we only maintain the bare minimum of records at the refuge. Our clients are a bit sensitive about having information kept on them. We certainly don't have anything from the 1970s. What about your regulars? Elise pressed on. Are any of them old enough to have been around in those days? Candace gave a rueful smile. Sadly, old age and homelessness tend not to go together. Then she frowned. Though there is one person. Deanie Watts had his own small room in sheltered accommodation. When Elise and Candace arrived, he insisted on making them a cup of tea. On the way, Candace had explained that Deanie had been homeless by choice for decades. He was only persuaded to move into sheltered accommodation when it became clear that he could no longer cope on his own. They sat round a little table. Elise explained why she was there and showed Deanie the photo. I'm looking for any information you can give me. Did you know this man, Duncan Ferguson? Deanie gazed at the photo for a long time. Elise wondered if he had dozed off. Eventually he spoke. Fargo, that was what we called him, he said. So you knew him? Elise said eagerly. Deanie turned. There were tears in his eyes. He was a good friend, he stated. He would share anything he had with you. Look after you if people were giving you grief. What happened to him? Elise asked. Deanie turned back to the photograph. There was another long silence. He told me that he was going to make money, Deanie said. Good money. Did he say how? Deanie shook his head. Only that it would be enough for us to get a place of our own, he said. He said he'd see me later. But I never saw him again. And that was all that Deanie would say. Elise questioned him gently, but he just shook his head, descending into silence, his eyes gazing far back into the past. The chief inspector appeared in the doorway of Elise's office. Could you give me an update? He asked. There's been progress, Chief, she revealed. The remains are from the late 1970s and are those of an adult male. The forensic evidence suggests that he was murdered. The chief inspector frowned. But how could human remains from the 1970s end up under a statue that was erected years before? We're still not clear about that, Elise said. But it's possible the base of the statue was moved in 1977. The park was being prepared for a visit from the late Queen as part of her Silver Jubilee celebrations. The chief inspector's face went pale. The last thing we need is royalty being brought into this, he said. The tabloids would be all over us. Elise stifled a smile. The chief inspector was very concerned about the police's public image. The good news is that Martin Hunter has identified the remains, Elise added. They belong to a homeless man and petty criminal Duncan Ferguson. He's our main focus for investigation. What's your next step? I'm going to speak to Justin O'Neill again, she stated. I've made an appointment to see him this morning. I want to find out if he knew the victim. Elise walked towards the door of the O'Neill mansion. She was trying to fit the evidence into some sort of pattern. Homeless people often lived chaotic, unsafe lives. It wasn't hard to imagine situations arising that might lead to a death. But how and why had the remains been buried under the statue's plinth? There were far easier ways to dispose of a body. An expensive-looking Jaguar was parked in front of the mansion. She clearly wasn't the only visitor. Justin answered the door and led her through to the lounge, where Corinne was chatting to a man with a very familiar face. D.I. Sharma? Have you met Rufus Burr? Justin asked. I have indeed, Elise answered. Rufus was a hard-headed and very pricey lawyer. Elise had come up against him numerous times in court in the past. They shook hands briefly. I asked Rufus to sit in during this meeting. Of course, Elise said. She found it interesting that Justin had felt it necessary to have his lawyer present. He was perfectly entitled to do so, but it did make her wonder if there was something about the case which troubled him. Rufus sat forward. I've explained to Mr. and Mrs. O'Neill that they are speaking to you on an entirely voluntary basis. They are under no obligation to answer any questions. Elise nodded. Absolutely, she agreed. I am simply here to gather background information on the case I'm working on. As it happens, I have some news. We have managed to identify the remains of the body found under the statue's plinth. Mr. O'Neill, does the name Duncan Ferguson mean anything to you? Elise was watching Justin closely, but there seemed to be no particular reaction on his face. He shook his head slowly. I don't think so. Is he the person found under the statue? Rufus asked sharply. We believe so, Elise replied. She was still watching Justin. He had begun to frown and touched a finger slowly to his lips. It was as if a vague memory was coming back to him. Hang on a minute, he said. Duncan Ferguson. There was someone way back in the early days. He was a young chap, a carpenter, I think. He worked for us for a while, but he was very unreliable. Terrible timekeeping. And you could often smell the drink on him. We got rid of him in the end. He turned to his wife. Do you remember, darling? Of course I don't. It was decades ago, she replied irritably. When was this? Elise asked Justin. He shrugged. Mid-70s, I think, he said. Not that I ever had much to do with him. It was Tony who dealt with the workforce. Corinne got up with her terrier in her arms. Is there anything else, Detective Inspector? She asked. I want to take Lori for a walk. We clearly have nothing more to tell you about this Fargo person. Rufus hurriedly stood up. Yes. I think this is a suitable time to end the meeting. Elise allowed herself to be shown out by Justin. As the door closed behind her, there was a cold smile on her lips. Rufus had brought the meeting to an abrupt end, and he had done so because he had noticed the same thing she had. If Corinne had no memory of Duncan Ferguson as she claimed, how had she known that people called him Fargo? Elise gazed at her computer with a frown. She had been checking to see if anyone involved in the investigation had a police record, apart from Duncan Ferguson. It turned out that Corinne O'Neill had been fined for speeding a couple of times, and Justin O'Neill had once failed a breathalyzer test back in the 1980s. But there was nothing more significant than that. However, as she checked the records, she noticed an attempted burglary at the O'Neill's house in 1977. The year caught Elise's attention and she brought up the details. The attempted burglary had been reported by Corinne, which made Elise wonder where Justin had been at the time. Corinne had apparently been out for the night and had come home to find evidence of a break-in. According to the report, there were signs of the house being searched, with cupboards and drawers hanging open. There were no details of anything being stolen, and it was thought the burglar may have been disturbed. An investigation was carried out, but the culprit was never identified. Elise would have thought no more of it except that, on checking the dates, she realized that the burglary took place close to the time when the statue had been removed for cleaning, though that didn't seem to be anything other than a coincidence. She pondered on the accumulating evidence as she drove through town. It was like working on a complicated jigsaw puzzle. The number of pieces was growing all the time. Somehow she had to fit them together into a pattern that made some sort of sense. She pulled up at a semi-detached house in a quiet street with a small, tidy front garden. An elderly woman in a maroon cardigan and plain skirt answered the door. Elise held up her identity card. "Mrs. Dunbar, thank you for agreeing to see me." The woman stepped back. "Come in, Detective Inspector." Margaret Dunbar was the sister of Tony Farrell, who had worked for Justin O'Neill back in the 1970s. She showed Elise into a small sitting room and went to make tea. Elise considered how best to approach the interview. There were different techniques that could be used in such circumstances. Sometimes you encouraged the person to think of you as a friend. Sometimes you reminded them of their duty as citizens to help the police. Occasionally you pressed the person hard. But with Margaret Dunbar, Elise thought that simply being straight with her might be the best approach. Margaret came back with the cups, teapot, and a few biscuits on a tray. Elise allowed her to go through the routine of pouring the tea and offering a biscuit. Only then did she begin. "You may have heard that human remains were recently found under the statue of Andrew Horville in the park." Margaret nodded. "It looks as if they were placed there in 1977, Elise added. "The Silver Jubilee year," the elderly woman said. Elise smiled. "Indeed," she said. "Justin O'Neill's company had been contracted to carry out some work in the park around that time. And your brother, Tony, acted as the supervisor. I'm trying to get a picture of the work and the people involved. Could you tell me a bit about your brother?" Margaret reached over to a framed photograph and handed it to Elise. A young man and woman sat on a rug at the beach, laughing at the camera. The woman was clearly a young Margaret. "Is that Tony with you?" Elise asked. "It was taken at Rill one summer," Margaret said. "We went there with Mum and Dad." Her eyes welled up. "Tony was a good-looking lad," Elise murmured. "He never had any trouble attracting girls." Elise thought there was a touch of bitterness to the comment, and she waited. After a moment, Margaret began to talk. Tony was a year older than his sister, and the two always got on well. Tony left school at 16 and became apprenticed to a builder. Aged around 20, he began working for Justin O'Neill. He did well, and after a couple of years had been promoted to supervisor. He had thrived on the responsibility. They all liked him as a supervisor, and Justin O'Neill put a lot of trust in him, Margaret concluded. "What about his personal life?" Elise asked. "Did he have anyone special?" Margaret shook her head. "He went out with any number of different girls," she said. "Did you see a lot of him?" Elise asked again. Margaret hesitated. "We had always been close," she began. "But then I got married, and the twins arrived soon after. That kept me busy, and I didn't see so much of Tony. Then something seemed to change between us." "How do you mean?" Elise inquired. "Tony and I had always shared everything," Margaret frowned. "We never had secrets. But it started to feel as if he was keeping things hidden from me." "What sort of things?" Elise said. "I wasn't sure," Margaret confessed. "But he stopped telling me about the women he was going out with, which was odd. He had always enjoyed female company. Do you think he was involved with someone, but in secret?" Elise asked. Margaret nodded. "Did you have any idea who?" The detective pressed again. There was a silence. Then Margaret sighed. "I did wonder about Corinne O'Neill." Elise sounded the knocker, and the door opened almost at once. The roofer, Reese, stood there with a spaniel by his feet and a lead in his hand. He looked at her in surprise. "D.I. Sharma. Hello again. I'm sorry to trouble you, Mr. Oldroyd. Could I have a word? I was about to take Jessie to the park. Can we walk and talk?" Elise smiled. "Of course. A bit of fresh air might help clear the cobwebs in my head." Reese zipped up his coat and pulled the door closed. "Is this about the case?" Elise nodded. "What do you remember about Tony Farrell?" Reese thought as they made their way along. "He was my boss," he said. "So the two of us were never exactly friends." "You considered him to be your boss rather than Justin O'Neill?" "Justin O'Neill owned the company, but we never saw much of him. It was Tony who was in charge of us." "So what sort of person was he?" Elise asked. "He was serious about the work," Reese replied. No messing with Tony. He insisted on high standards, but if you did your job properly, then he didn't give you grief. Generally, I'd say that Tony was fine as bosses go. At first, at least. Elise frowned. At first? It was odd, Reese said. He seemed to change. He became short-tempered and snappy. And he started to let things slip at work as if he didn't care anymore. When was this? Elise questioned. Hard to say exactly. But I had enough in the end, and I left early in 1978. Did you keep up with your old workmates? Reese pursed his lips. I bumped into some of them occasionally, he revealed. I heard that Tony had left the company not long after I did. Any idea what caused the change in his personality? Elise asked. Not really. It happened quickly. It was sad. Really? Elise gazed at the crime board in her office. It was a mass of photographs, names, dates, and information. In her hand, she held the 1977 report of the burglary at the Onnells. It was around the same time that the statue of Andrew Horville had been removed for cleaning and Reese had suspected that the plinth had been moved. Was it just coincidence? Then there was the possible relationship between Corinne O'Neill and Tony Farrell. It was only a suspicion of his sisters, but what if that had been true? Then there was the fact that Corinne apparently knew the victim, Duncan Ferguson. Elise grimaced. She felt she had all the pieces of the jigsaw. She just couldn't seem to fit them together. There was a knock at her door. It was the chief inspector. He joined her by the crime board. Any closer to wrapping up the case? He asked. Elise knew that he was keen for the case to be signed off and filed away, but she wasn't in a position to give him that satisfaction yet. I'm sorry, Chief, she said. There's still some way to go. But a good deal of progress has been made. The remains have been identified, and the victim was apparently murdered. Do we know how the remains could have been buried under the plinth? He asked again. According to Reese Oldroyd, Elise began, there was a forklift truck on the site at the time. It might have been used to partially lift the plinth so that the remains could be placed underneath. It was a secluded area. With the park closed for the restoration work, witnesses were unlikely. The chief inspector shook his head with a sigh. It's all mights and coulds. What we don't have is any direct evidence as to who was responsible. That's true, Chief, but Elise was interrupted by a rapid knock. PC Colin McFarlane hurried in. Apologies, D.I. Sharma, he said, but I thought you'd want to know. A report has just come in about a disturbance at Justin O'Neill's house. According to a neighbor, there have been shouts, screams, and the sound of breaking glass. Elise drove fast with Colin at her side. Another squad car was following them. A domestic disturbance wouldn't normally involve an officer of her seniority, but it was possible that something was happening that affected the case. When they arrived at the mansion, Elise told the constables in the second squad car to wait. Come with me, Colin. She didn't need to ring the bell. A glass panel in the door had been smashed using a flower pot, and the door was swinging open. Elise could hear raised voices. She and Colin hurried through the house. In the lounge, Elise stopped in shock. Corinne O'Neill and Margaret Dunbar were yelling at each other, both women's cheeks red with emotion. Justin was half leaning against the window seat, gazing at them with a stunned look on his face. I knew something had gone wrong in Tony's life, Margaret was shouting. Something terrible happened that he had to keep secret from me. What I didn't know was that it involved a vile woman like you. How dare you speak to me like that, you harridan? Corinne retorted. You know nothing about your brother and what he was really like. Call the others, Colin. Elise ordered. Then she hurriedly intervened between the two women. Took some minutes to calm the situation down. In the end, both Corinne and Margaret had to be placed in handcuffs and taken to the police station separately. Elise turned to Justin. He had remained in the window seat as if dazed by disbelief. Are you all right, Mr. O'Neill? Elise asked. He gazed at her, his eyes filled with confusion. She was having a relationship with Tony Farrell, he muttered. I knew nothing about it. Why don't we go to the station, Mr. O'Neill? Elise said. We can talk there. At the police station, Elise found an empty interview room. With Colin at her side, she listened as Justin described the events from earlier in the evening. Corinne went to answer the door. There had immediately been raised voices. Justin had found his wife grappling with Margaret Dunbar, who was shouting all kinds of accusations. "What accusations?" Elise asked. "Mad things, I thought," Justin retorted. "That she'd been having an affair with Tony. That she'd killed Duncan Ferguson when he found out. That she'd persuaded Tony to bury the body. It was all nonsense. It had to be." But Corinne didn't deny any of it. Elise moved on to interview Margaret Dunbar. "I'm so sorry for my behavior earlier, D.I. Sharma," she said. "It was unforgivable. But when I read Tony's account of what had happened, I was so angry." "Tony's account?" Elise frowned. "Your visit stirred up so many memories," she began. "After you left, I went through Tony's things. I have a box of personal items I had never looked at. It was too painful. But I found a letter there for me. A confession." She brought out an envelope. "To my lovely Megs," it said on the outside. Her hand shook as she handed it across the table. It wasn't until the next morning that Elise interviewed Corinne O'Neill. Rufus Burr sat by his client's side. Elise opened a file containing a copy of the confession letter. "It turns out that Tony Farrell left a written account of what happened between you and him, Mrs. O'Neill," Elise began. Rufus looked up sharply. "What evidence do you have that this so-called confession was actually written by Farrell?" Elise had been watching Corinne closely. She was gazing transfixed at the letter. "That's Tony's writing," she said in a whisper. Annoyance flickered across Rufus Barr's face. Elise continued quickly. "Perhaps if I go through what Tony wrote, then you can correct any aspects of his account with which you disagree, Mrs. O'Neill." Elise spoke calmly and slowly about how Corinne had made her attraction to Tony very clear, and how their affair began at her instigation. They would get together when Justin was out of town for work. One night, returning to the mansion late from a club, they disturbed a burglar who had escaped. The next evening, they discovered the burglar was Duncan Ferguson when he confronted them in Andrew Horville Park. Duncan wanted money, or he would inform Justin O'Neill about their relationship. To Tony's horror, Corinne clubbed Duncan with a hammer and killed him. She persuaded Tony to help her get rid of the body. Under the plinth seemed an obvious place. "Have I got anything wrong, Mrs. O'Neill?" Elise asked. "You're under no obligation to answer," Rufus said hurriedly. But Corinne shook her head slowly. "I thought we could put it behind us and get on with our lives," she said. "But Tony was pathetic. I loved him, but he was such a weak man." Elise thought of Tony Farrell's letter. His description of his life being destroyed by what had happened. He suffered constant flashbacks and nightmares. His relationship with his sister had been ruined, too. Duncan Ferguson had died far too young. So much misery had come from the events of that evening. "Don't you have regrets, Mrs. O'Neill?" Elise said. Corinne looked at her for a long moment, then shrugged. "Only that I've been found out." Story number 5. Could Sergeant Erin Coombs connect these holiday burglaries? It's hot today. Sergeant Erin Coombs fanned herself before switching on the police car's air conditioning. "Okay. Josh, tell me what you know about this burglary." Constable Josh Meacham double-checked his notes while Erin drove out of the car park. "The burglary was reported by a lady called Viola Swain," he explained. "She was watering the garden at her son's place while the family are away on holiday. She noticed that a window at the back of the house had been forced open. She went inside and discovered they'd been burgled. Quite a bit of furniture's been taken, among other things." Erin raised her eyebrows. "Quite a bit of furniture? Sounds like someone's setting themselves up, ready to move into a new house." "That's what I thought," Josh agreed. Viola Swain's son's house was just outside Warrendale, a pretty village on the outskirts of the area covered by Temple Park's police station. Erin pulled up outside a cream-painted, one-story weatherboard house at the end of a quiet street near the river. A gray-haired woman waved at them from the front deck. Erin looked around as she got out of the car. All the houses were on large blocks. She'd knock on the neighbors' doors later, but the chances they'd seen anything were slim. A chocolate Labrador started barking as they walked up the driveway towards the deck. Viola Swain soothed the dog. "I've been waiting outside," she said as Erin and Josh climbed the steps onto the deck. I didn't want to be in there on my own. Her mouth trembled. That's understandable, Erin said. They've taken a lot of stuff, Mrs. Swain told them. They must have had a large van to take it all away. She showed Erin and Josh around the house. The dining table, a sofa and flat-screen TV had been taken from the family room, and beds and chests of drawers from the children's bedrooms. The clothes from the chests of drawers had been tipped on to the polished floorboards. Bookcases had been taken, too, and an air fryer and microwave had been stolen from the kitchen along with the cutlery drawer. When they'd finished looking around, Josh made coffee while Mrs. Swain and Erin sat on stools at the kitchen counter. Erin took out her notebook. I know you've already gone through this once, Mrs. Swain, but could you tell me what time you discovered the break-in? At 8:30 this morning, Mrs. Swain replied. I was taking Coco for an early walk because of the hot weather. Coco jumped up at the mention of his name and she fondled his ears. He's the kid's dog, not mine. He's staying at my place while they're away. Anyway, I thought I'd drop by here to water the garden. Jody likes her flowers. She pointed out of the window to a garden colorful with roses, hydrangeas, and various potted plants. That's when I noticed the bathroom window had been forced open. The family don't have a burglar alarm or any other kind of security? Erin asked. No. I've mentioned to Brendan that they should. But it's always so quiet around here and they've never bothered. Erin nodded. Other than the occasional bit of graffiti, Warrendale wasn't known for crime. She'd worked at Temple Park's police station for 6 years and could count her visits to Warrendale on one hand. Prior to this morning, when was the last time you were here? She queried. Around 6 o'clock last night when I watered the garden and picked up the post. Everything was fine then, so the burglary had happened overnight, presumably sometime after midnight and before 5 o'clock this morning, when it was dark and people were asleep. When are Jody and Brendan due home? Erin asked. They were due back on Saturday, but they're heading back now. They wanted to come back as soon as I'd told them what happened. Mrs. Swain glanced at the clock on the wall above the sink. They should be back in an hour or so. They're down at Darby Creek National Park. Camping. Darby Creek was about 3 hours from Warrendale, Erin calculated. Who knew that Jody and Brendan were away? Well, I did, obviously. And Rosemary next door did, because she's been putting the bins out for them. And my other daughter and her family did. I suppose the children's friends from school knew, but none of them would be responsible. She reached for the coffee mug Josh placed in front of her. It'll be a stranger, won't it? Someone who's been watching the street and noticed the empty house. We'll keep all our options open for now, Erin replied. I'll arrange for forensics to come in to look for fingerprints. We will talk to the neighbors to find out if they saw or heard anything. We'll come back and talk to Jody and Brendan later. Erin and Josh didn't have much luck with the neighbors. Rosemary, who looked to be around Viola Swain's age, said she'd heard the sound of a truck in the street at some stage during the night but had ignored it. I thought it was just a truck driver who'd taken a wrong turning. It happens. A neighbor a couple of doors up said his dog had started barking at around 2 o'clock in the morning. I thought he'd heard a possum or a wallaby outside or something, he said. I told him to be quiet. I wish now I'd let him out. If he'd gone down to the fence and kept barking, I'd have come out to see what the matter was. Probably was the burglars who made the dog bark. Erin said as she and Josh walked back to the Swains' house. But we can't be sure of it. When Brendan and Jody Swain arrived home, they couldn't add anything to what Mrs. Swain had already told Erin and Josh. The kids' friends knew we were going away, and so their parents would have as well, Jody told them. Her hand shook as she reached for a glass of water on the kitchen counter. But none of them would do anything like this. The local primary school is small and all the parents know each other. We're a tight-knit community. What about people at your workplaces? Josh asked them. Well, yes, some of them knew, but you can't suspect them, surely, Brendan replied. He looked exhausted. The children, aged 10 and 9, had been upset when they'd learned their bedroom furniture had been stolen. Mrs. Swain had taken them and Coco back to her house so her daughter and son-in-law could talk to the police. People talk and can give away information to the wrong person without realizing. Erin told them. I'm going to need you to give me a list of everything that was stolen. I suppose our stuff's going to be sold online or at markets. Brendan muttered. Given what's been taken, I think someone's setting themselves up in a new house, Aaron replied. But we'll be keeping an eye on the usual places and an eye out for any leads. Between other jobs, Aaron and Josh tried and failed to find leads on the burglary at the Swains' house. Forensics hadn't turned up any clues. Clearly the burglars had known how to cover their tracks. A few days later, Aaron was catching up on paperwork following a traffic accident when she was interrupted by a call about a similar burglary. This time, a woman called Kim Lenton, who lived only a few streets away from the police station, had returned from holiday to discover her home had been broken into. Again, a combination of furniture and household goods had been stolen, including a queen-sized bed, a dressing table, and a fridge. Although the houses were much closer to each other than the ones at Warrendale, they were surrounded by trees. Kim Lenton was a single mother who had been on holiday with her mother, Julie, and her 9-year-old son, Zach. They didn't have a burglar alarm because their cat used the cat flap while they were away. Our neighbor came in to feed the cat every day, Kim told them. The garage door was closed when she came round yesterday afternoon, but was open when we got back today at lunchtime. Who else knew you were away? Aaron asked. My sister, who lives about 10 minutes away, and some of Zach's friends and their families. I can't believe this. Kim's face crumpled. It's the first holiday I've been able to take Zach on since his dad left us. I hired a cabin down at Darby Creek National Park. And now this. Aaron looked up sharply from her notebook. Darby Creek? Did you make friends with anyone there? And did you become friendly enough to give them your address? Darby Creek National Park had wonderful beaches, and every summer, hundreds of people headed down there. There was no reason why a seemingly friendly person in the barbecue area wasn't masterminding burglaries and finding out where other campers lived. Mom and I kept to ourselves, really, Kim said. Because we had the cabin, we didn't need to use the barbecues or the amenities block. We spent the days swimming, walking and reading, and we would sit outside the cabin with a glass of wine in the evenings. Zach made friends, though, at Nippers. He loved it. Aaron knew about Nippers. Her own children had done it a couple of years ago during a family holiday at Wattlebark Bay. Nippers was a beach education program run by local surf life-saving clubs. The children enjoyed swimming in the sea, sprinting for flags on the beach, board paddling, and other activities, while the local surf lifesavers taught them how to spot a rip current and the signs of imminent freak waves. My children loved it too, she told Kim. Did he meet his friends' parents? Maybe he talked to them about where he lived. I doubt it, Kim replied. He knows not to give out personal information to strangers. All the same, Aaron's first move when she left the house was to get back in touch with the Swains. Jody answered her call. Do you have any news? She asked hopefully. No news, but a possible lead, Aaron replied. Did your children take part in the Nippers program while you were at Darby Creek? Yes, they did. Do you think it's to do with someone from Nippers? Possibly. Could you talk to your children and get the names of the friends they made there? Josh had been busy, too, while Aaron had been talking to Jody Swain. I just did a social media check to find posts by people who'd been burgled this summer. I found a couple, not people from our area, but both of them had spent a week camping at Darby Creek with their kids. Nice work, Josh. Aaron nodded. We'd better have a chat with them, I think. Aaron got out of the car and stretched. It had been a long drive down to Darby Creek National Park. But it was worth it, she thought, drinking in the view. From the car park on the headland she could see the long stretch of white sand beach. The beach was busy with tourists. Lifeguards from the Darby Creek Surf Lifesavers Club, wearing their distinctive yellow shirts and red shorts and caps, stood by the flags that marked the stretch of water where it was safe to swim. There was a Nipper session going on. The children were out on paddleboards. 2 more surf lifesavers were on paddleboards, too, keeping an eye on them. Josh joined her. I wouldn't mind a swim myself. I wouldn't either, Aaron admitted. She'd brought her swimming costume just in case there was time later. But we're here to work. They beelined for the visitors center. Over summer, one small room became a makeshift police office. 2 police constables worked there from early December to the beginning of February to ensure tourists didn't break the local speed limits or get into any intoxicated fights. It would be a breeze of a job. This, Josh commented. as the park ranger pointed them towards the police office. "I wouldn't mind it myself. Dish out speeding tickets, have a surf." The constable on duty, Rory Willars, certainly seemed cheerful enough and happy to help Aaron and Josh obtain the information they needed. He introduced them to the park rangers who took accommodation and campsite bookings. They agreed to compile a list of names of people who were spending the entire summer there. Rory also promised to organize a list of staff who were working at the park all summer. "We're particularly interested in any families who've stayed all summer whose children might have done nippers each week," Aaron said. "You'll have to get those names from the Surf Lifesaving Club," Rory told them. While they waited for the rangers to organize the lists they needed, Aaron and Josh talked to Rory about the case and then about his summer work at Darby Creek. "I bet you get to surf every day," Josh said. "Not every day," Rory replied, "but a couple of times a week. Though you can guarantee that if I've got any free time, that's when it'll rain." The list of families who'd spent over a month at Darby Creek was lengthy. Still, Aaron thought, scanning it would be narrowed down once they had the list of children who'd done nippers. If that got nowhere, then there was the list of staff to go through. But she was certain that nippers was the connection. "Nippers will be over now," Rory said eventually. "Let's go down." As they walked through the campground to the beach, Rory was seized upon by a small boy on a bicycle. "Look, Constable Willars. I can ride this without training wheels now." "That's awesome," Rory enthused. The boy's mother came out of the tent to talk to him, and he signaled to Aaron and Josh that he wouldn't be long. Outside a nearby tent, a boy and a girl were sitting wrapped in towels, talking to their mother. "Why can't we have a dog?" the boy grumbled. "I've told you over and again, your dad and I are out at work, you're at school, and we can't leave a dog on its own all day." "It could do doggy daycare," the girl pointed out. "It could. And that costs a lot of money, you know." "What's brought this on anyway?" the mum asked. "It's the first time you've mentioned wanting a dog for ages. We're the only kids at Nippers who don't have pets." "I'm sure that's not true." "It is," the girl protested. "Daniel, one of the surf lifesavers, was asking us all about our pets. Everybody else has got a dog or a cat, and he was asking them who was looking after them while they were away. They'd all got house sitters, apart from one girl whose auntie was moving in to look after the cat. Perhaps we could get house sitters while you and Dad are at work," the boy put in. "Anyway, we were the only ones who had to tell him we don't have any pets." "What did this Daniel say to that, then?" "He said, well, at least our parents hadn't had to organize house sitters." Aaron felt Josh's nudge against her elbow. "Did you hear what they just said, Sarge?" he murmured. "I certainly did," she answered. "I'll have a chat with the mum and we will have a watch put on their house. And you and Rory had better have a word with Daniel." In the end, Aaron didn't have to put a watch on the family's house. When Josh and Rory arrived at the clubhouse, they caught Daniel in the act of making a phone call, giving someone an address. It turned out that he and his two brothers worked together, stealing goods to order. His brothers had bought a van that they used to drive away goods from the houses they burgled, and Daniel used his work with the Surf Lifesavers to find addresses that would be empty over summer. When parents signed their children up for nippers, they had to give their names and addresses, and all Daniel had to do was chat to the children about what was happening with their pets. The good news for the families they'd stolen from was that not all the goods had been disposed of yet, and that it would be easy for the police to trace who the others had gone to. "That was a good day's work," Josh said, as he and Aaron walked back to the car. "That's got us closer to our arrest targets for the month." "Very true," Aaron agreed. "Did you bring your swimming trunks with you?" "I did, as it happens." "Well, then, Constable, why don't we have a swim before we head off home? I reckon we've earned it." "I reckon we have, too," he replied, reaching in the car for his bag. We are slipping now, all the masks have fallen to the floor. The veteran, the professional sicario, is walking me through a key assignment he completed. Their backs were like leather and did not bleed. They put plastic bags on their heads to smother them and then revive them with alcohol under their noses. All they ever said to us was, "We will see you in hell." This went on for 3 days. They smelled terrible because of the burns. They brought in a doctor to keep reviving them. They wanted them to live one more day. After a while they defecated blood. They shoved broomsticks up their asses. The second day a person came and told them, "I warned you this was going to happen." They said, "Kill us." The guys lived 3 days. The doctor kept injecting them to keep them alive and he had to work hard. Eventually they died of the torture. They never asked God for help. They just kept saying, "We will see you in hell." I buried them with their faces down and poured on a whole lot of lime. He is excited. It is all back. He can feel the shovel in his hand. He is calm now. He is revisiting this evil time, he says, simply for my benefit. He takes his various drawings, how to do a hit where some people were buried in a death house, looks at the green schematics he has created, and then slowly tears them into little squares until the torn heap can never be reconstructed. Until late 2006, he worked all over Mexico for different groups, and the various organizations generally got along. There were small moments, such as when others tried to take over Juarez and it was necessary to necklace them. But his life in the main was calm. So calm he did not need to know who he really worked for. I received orders from 2 people. They ran me. I never knew which cartel I worked for. Now there is Vicente Carrillo against Chapo Guzman. That is, Joaquin Guzman Lora, head of Mexico's largest cartel. But I never met any bosses, so when the war started around 2006, I did not know which one I did the killing for. And orders could cross from one group to another. I am living in a cell and I simply take orders. In 30 minutes in Juarez, 60 well-trained and heavily armed men can assemble in 30 cars and circulate as a show of force. Then, at my level, we began to get orders to kill each other. He is kidnapped but let go after an hour. This unsettles him, and he begins to think about escaping his life. But that is not a simple matter, since if you leave you are murdered. As the war escalates, he begins to distance himself from people he knows and works with. He tries to fade away. By this time, a third of the people he knows have been killed. They were seen as useless and then killed. He doesn't know the boss, he is still not even sure who his boss is. He drinks at home. The streets are too dangerous. New people arrive and he does not know them. He is not safe. So he flees. He confides in a friend, who betrays him. He pauses at this point. He knows he is guilty of a fatal error. He has violated a fundamental rule. You can be betrayed only by someone you trust. So you survive by trusting no one. Still, there is this shred of humanity in all of us, and in the end we feel the need to trust someone, to call someone friend, to share feelings with others. And this need is fatal. It is the very need he has exploited for years, the need he used when he put people in the police car and told them they would be all right if they cooperated, would be back with their families in no time if they were calm. And by God, they did trust him and rode across Mexico, went through checkpoints and said nothing, never told a single soul they had been kidnapped. They would trust him as they were tortured in the safe houses. They would help mop the floors, clean up the vomit and blood. They would compose songs. They would trust him right up to that instant when he strangled them. So his friend gives him up. He is taken at 10 p.m., and this time he is held until 3 a.m. But something has changed within him, and some things have not changed. For men take him to a safe house. They remove all of his clothing but his shorts. They take pool balls in their hands and beat him. But he can tell they are amateurs. They do not even handcuff him, and this is disturbing to him. He is the captive of third-raters. As they beat him, he prays and prays and prays. He also laughs because he is appalled by their incompetence. They have not bound him, and their blows do not disable him. He sizes them up and in his mind plans how he will kill them 1, 2, 3, 4, just like that. And at the same moment, he is praying to God to help him so that he will not kill them, so that he can stop his life of murder. As he sits in the room, sipping coffee and recalling this moment, his face comes alive. He is passionate now. He is approaching the very moment of his salvation. Some people pretend to accept Christ, he says, but at that moment he could feel total acceptance fill his body. He could feel peace. They point rifles at him. He cannot stop laughing. I was afraid, he explains. I realized I would have to kill them all. 2 of the armed men left. 1 other guy went to the bathroom. He looks at the remaining captor. The guy says, I don't have a problem with you. Once you told me to be careful or they would kill me. You did me a favor. So, I am praying to God. Help me. I don't want to kill these people. And I know I can do it rapidly. The guy turns his back on me and says, get out, go. He opens the door and runs without his shoes or clothes. His face is stern now. He has come to the place, the very moment that has permitted him to recount the kidnappings, the tortures, the killings. He is selling, and what he is selling is God. He is believing, and what he believes based on his own life is that anyone can be redeemed. And that it is possible to leave the organization and survive.